erode over time. Critical voices fade away as more and more positions are filled with the president's friends and allies. President Putin clearly no longer received reliable information and advice on the Ukraine people's will and ability to resist his military machine, let alone the legal, political and moral consequences of starting such a war of aggression. You remember, it would have only lasted for 3 days. In the draft resolution before you, I have summed up the main findings of this report in such a way as to send a strong signal to the international community and to Russian society. They should understand that the waiver of the presidential term limit in favor of President Putin is not legitimate, not even in accordance with Russia's own constitution. It is also not in line with international standards designed to protect checks and balances, thus preventing a descent into dictatorship with all its nefarious consequences for Russia and her neighbors. The relevant constitutional changes were adopted in an accelerated procedure, which is not foreseen in the Russian constitution. The regular constitutional amendment procedure requires the convention of a constitutional assembly and that there shall be specific amending laws for each of the changes proposed, rather than a single en bloc vote on all the different amendments, and there were a lot. Instead, a new ad hoc procedure was introduced by a single amending law, and after an opinion by the Constitutional Court, which was given within 7 days, an ad hoc nationwide vote was held that was not subject to the strict safeguards applicable to proper referendums. As the Venice Commission says, the procedure used to amend the Constitution therefore creates an obvious tension with Article 16 of the Constitution, which safeguards the firm fundamentals of the constitutional system of the Russian Federation. It also violates the principle that changes to presidential term limits should be subject to thorough public scrutiny, that they should be supported by a broad consensus, and that any changes should only apply to future office holders, not to the incumbent. To be perfectly clear, these findings are not my own findings, or those of the Committee of Legal Affairs. They were the findings of the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission adopted 2 important opinions, which I've quoted extensively in the explanatory report. It should be noted that Russia was still a member of the Council of Europe, and it still cooperated with the Venice Commission in the preparation of the 2021 opinion. The representatives of the Russian authorities tried to convince the Venice Commission that sufficient checks and balances would remain despite lengthening Mr. Putin's time in office by another 12 years, starting in 2024. They pointed to the competitive political system, the independent judiciary, and a lively civil society. At the time, the Venice Commission was not convinced. By now, we know for sure that this was a complete mockery. What was left of civil society in 2021 has been completely destroyed in the meantime. The last remaining opposition politicians are either in prison, please remember Vladimir Kara-Murza and Alexei Navalny, or are in exile. Finally, the sham trials against them and many others, such as anti-war protesters, show us the true nature of the Russian judiciary. It's now up to us to send a clear signal to the world at large, but also to the people of Russia, that at the latest, after the end of the current mandate, President Putin should no longer be its legitimate leader. I therefore invite you to adopt the draft resolution before you. I look forward to our discussion, also about what consequences need to be drawn from our findings and those of the Venice Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Omtzigt. And now we came to the speakers on behalf of the political groups. In the debate, I call first Mrs. Saskia Duit. Our next speaker is Mrs. Bilodzier. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, dear President, dear friends. When it comes to President Putin and the uninvited violence that comes from his aggressive regime, my country has, alas, enough hands-on experience since the downing of MH17. That careless act of violence that cost so many people their lives made very clear the enormous dangers that the failing state of Russia proposes to others. And not only the peoples nearby Russia, like the people of Ukraine, Georgia, or Chechnya, who suffered already enormously. But since MH17, we know that even families in countries far away from Russia, like Malaysia, Australia, Indonesia, and my own country, are not safe. And therefore, also many families have to mourn their loved ones, all because of the acts of Vladimir Putin and his failing regime. Today, I will speak on behalf of the SOC group, and we are reporter Pieter Omtzigt and the Secretariat very grateful for the research they have done and for the proposed resolution. The resolution clearly states the direct relation between safeguarding the principles for strong democracy and democratic governance and the origins of aggressive and undemocratic behavior by a state. Only by applying democratic principles, the important checks and balances for democratic functioning of a state can blossom. And a state will be able only then to uphold the international rule of law and the human rights in that country. The current Russian president, Vladimir Putin, thinks he can stay in power until 2036. There is, however, enough evidence that Vladimir Putin has not only neglected international laws and legal principles when he expanded his personal term for presidency, he also neglected his own laws and his constitution while doing so. So even when we would be prepared to neglect these acts, which we do not, the new rules should only have applied to a new president and not to Vladimir Putin. We therefore strongly agree that Putin's term should end on the previous applicable time moment. He should furthermore be arrested as soon as possible and to be held accountable for his actions relating to all events on the territory of Ukraine. By this we mean all events, from February 2014, starting with the illegal annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbas region, and the downing of Flight MH17. I will wrap up, President, by expressing our continuous strong support for the creation of an ad hoc international criminal tribunal, so when the time has come, we will be able to keep Vladimir Putin accountable for all the awful actions his regime has put upon the world.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Luit. Our next speaker is Mrs. Bilosier.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, first of all, I want to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Omtzigt, for really good report, though I would not say it's timely report of pace, as the motion was tabled months before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Moreover, it refers to 2020, when Russia made changes to its constitution, allowing Putin to remain in office practically forever until 2036. As a result of this decision, we had bad consequences, dramatic for the future of our nation. Unfortunately, Ukraine is fully experienced with what it means to have a neighbor country with unlawful increasing presidential time limits. The consolidation of power in the hands of Putin lead and turn to dictatorship. Russia's aggression in Ukraine is a bright example of how autocratic leader that is 20 years in power destabilized the entire world, threaten global peace and security. Not willing to enter the fight directly with NATO, Putin, that probably will be elected 5th time, fueling conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Serbia and Kosovo, and now in the Middle East, continues its criminal war of attrition against Ukraine. Putin, with its endless terms, became a terrorist #1 in the world, and today 600 days of brutal, exhausting war in Ukraine. When Russian terrorists kill, torture, kidnap, rape civilians, 20,000 children were kidnapped, 542 killed. Like in Israel, handwriting is the same. Ukrainians feel the pain and anger of the people of Israel as its own. This is what a peace must lead to. And lesson from Israel must be the one that just as you can't negotiate with Hamas, you can't negotiate with Putin either. It's time finally to recognize Putin and his government as illegitimate after the end of his current presidential term and restrict all contacts with them. Not only because it will be his 5th term, not only the term limit was waived, violating both the Russian constitutions and all international legal principles, but because this election will be carried out in Ukrainian territories, temporarily occupied Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia region, Kherson region that Russia invaded. We need more weapons because our victory and liberation of our land will also blow legitimacy of Putin inside Russia. We all had enough of his presidency. We can't bring lost lives, but our common responsibility to restore justice as much as possible. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. In the debate, I call next Mr. Koncharenko, and our next speaker will be Paul Gavin.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Omczyk for a great job and for this report. I think maybe we even now underestimate the value of this report. It's not just about Putin, it's not just about the fact that he is dictator, it's about a much wider picture. Why democracy matters. And on the example of Russia and Putin, we see why democracy matters. When you have a dictator and dictatorship, and it's clearly said here in this report that Putin is dictator, no questions about this, and Russia is dictatorship. And when you have such situation in country, this country will suffer enormously. Just watch at Russia. The most rich country in the world from the point of view of natural resources, and the most poor people in Europe. Putin, who lives in awful and huge palaces, one of the, maybe the richest person in the world, Putin, and Russian people who don't have a toilets in their houses. In 21st century, they need to go on the street to toilet. That's what is dictatorship. And the most important, hundreds of thousands of people killed, both Russians and other nationalities. First of all, Ukrainians, which is so painful for me, but not only, Georgians. You can watch Syria, you can watch what happened in Czech Republic, in the United Kingdom, in Moldova, in other countries. Putin is all in blood. So when you lose democracy, then you lose your welfare, and then you lose your lives. And one person became an awful, dangerous, and crazy dictator. Just imagine Putin is president from 2000. So when you don't change your governments, when you don't change your presidents, that is the result. And that is a very serious lesson which should be taken from the situation in Russia. And one more thing. Russia is dictatorship. It's clearly said by this report. The words matter. They matter because Putin thinks that he can outlive this, that then everybody will come to business as usual with him. He just thinks, I need to wait, and they will come back, they're weak. No, our strength is not in people, but our strength is in institutions and in rule of law. And when we said Putin is dictator, we will never come back to business as usual with him. That is the most important. Several days ago, Putin celebrated his birthday. You know, we like on birthdays cakes, people happy. It's not about Putin. Putin was happy to see Hamas attack on Israel on his birthday. Blood on the streets. Thousands of killed people. That was the best present for Putin. And now we are making our present to Putin. From the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which unites 46 countries, we are saying Putin is dictator, Russian is dictatorship. No way to business as usual, dictatorship, will need to end as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goncharenko. Our next speaker is Mr. Paul Gavin.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to congratulate Mr. Omzik, who I think has a habit of writing very good reports for this Assembly. As the report points out, the motion for a resolution originated in January 2022, just before the invasion of Ukraine took place, and the legitimacy and legality of the amendments to the Russian Constitution enacted in July 2020 must be challenged. The Venice Commission has clearly criticised the amendments, the procedure, their content, and the speed at which they were pushed through. It has long been established that the purpose of presidential term limits is to enhance the balance and checks of power in a democracy. Exceeding those term limits is a blatant and obvious example of democratic principles being thrown out the window and being replaced with dictatorship. Vladimir Putin has succeeded in cementing his reign of power in the constitution of the Russian Federation at the expense of real democracy. With this extreme extension of term limits and the processes used to ram them through as law, these amendments to the Russian Constitution have all the characteristics of a textbook example of abusive constitutionalism, as outlined in the words of David Landau and Rosalind Dixon. In other words, constitutional processes that are used to promote distinctly anti-democratic ends or to advance the cause of would-be autocrats by removing democratic checks and balances on the exercise of political power. The new laws which aim to keep Putin in power are frightening, in addition to the fact that any remaining politicians who oppose the regime are imprisoned or forced into exile. Indeed, it's no coincidence that the only other leader across Europe with a similar reign of unbroken rule is President Aliyev of Azerbaijan. And you can see no end of similar characteristics in terms of the type of autocratic regime where democratic principles are discarded, where political prisoners are tortured systemically. This is no coincidence, and I really do hope that just as we dealt with Russia, that we will deal with the fundamentally undemocratic regime of Azerbaijan in the next sitting of this Parliament. As this is my final time to speak, I'll finish by once again calling for freedom for Julian Assange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kavan. Is Mr. Zingeris in the room? Not yet, so we go to the speaker list. Our next speaker is Mr. Lukas Savickas.
Thank you, dear President, dear colleagues. I invite us to see the facts as they are. Mr. Putin has been continuously in power since the year 2000, and he has served 2 consecutive 4-year terms between 2000 and 2008, and will have completed 2 consecutive 6-year terms between 2012 and 2024. Changes made to the Russian Constitution enacted in July 2020 would allow him to remain in office as president until year 2036, an overall period of 36 years. Dear colleagues, 36 years. We have often in this assembly talked about keeping dialogue open with democratic forces in Russia. But how is it possible when their country's perspective is sealed for another decade to come? And any country that extends presidential term limit beyond the usual 2 terms of 4 or 5 years is taking a large step away from democracy and the rule of law. Because institutional checks and balances erode over time as the key positions are progressively occupied by allies of the president and dissenting voices disappear from president's inner circle. Those term limits also serve to keep in check those who might be tempted to use the presidential power to curtail any opposition. And the report rightfully endorses Venice Commission's finding that ad hominem term limit waiver for incumbent president violates both the Russian Constitution and international principles. And the concrete facts are well presented in this report. But the overwhelming power of President resulting from his extreme long term in office, combined with lack of any checks and balances such as strong parliament, independent judiciary, free media, vibrant civil society, has turned Russian Federation into de facto dictatorship. And that means it constitutes a threat to international peace and security. Dictatorships destroy the fundamental rights, social, economic well-being of their own population as well. It is therefore in the interest, first and foremost, of the people of Russian Federation, but also of Europe and the world, that democracy is restored in Russian Federation. I hope that we as an assembly will send a clear message today. First, to the competent Russian constitutional bodies to reverse the waiver of presidential term limit for Mr. Putin, but also to international community as a whole to minimize contacts with Mr. Putin. Therefore, it is an interest of us all. It is in the interest of preserving democracy and rule of law in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I want to call Mr. Zingeris on behalf of EPP. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Madam Speaker. Dear friends, we are facing a credible change in Russia Federation. So we cannot say that we never have trust in democracy. I was among people in the 90s making negotiations with Russia, with Soviet Union, and with Mr. Yeltsin. Two entities, Soviet Union, Gorbachev, so-called reformer, but he was responsible for bloodshed in Tbilisi and in Vilnius, and Mr. Yeltsin, who was trying to restore first steps, uncertain steps towards democracy. I remember in Moscow, hundreds of thousands of Russians with inscription "Freedom for the Baltic countries." Who they are now? Starovoytova, Politkovskaya, my good friend Boris Nemtsov, killed on the spot. I was the key investigator and actually rapporteur on the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. When we sent letters from this House, Madam Speaker, to Russia Federation for cooperation in the in clarification of how Nemtsov were killed, we received letters which still are framed in the Committee on Human Rights. Letters was with the answer: Russia Post not found the House of the Senate of Russia Federation. Means Russia Post officially give the answer that such a place like Parliament of Russia doesn't exist. Of course, it was answer from the authorities. They don't want to be in cooperation with Council of Europe how Nemtsov were killed. So hopeless. 24 years of diminishing of democracy, hunting Democrats, fake elections, terrible fake changes in constitution. Russians have the expression referendum на пеньках. It's difficult to translate what that means, на пеньках. It means improvised. Improvised collected voices and fake voices and fake votes and fake voting. So I would like to congratulate my good friend Peter Omczyk, touching the essence. Democracy in Russia stopped to exist. Elections are fake, not free and fair anymore. And our point is that Russia become dangerous for all the world, trying to attack our not only democratic values, but physically to destroy democratic world. The target of Russia FSB and their allies like Iran is, and partly China, is to diminish the space of democratic world, to undermine our key values, make a mockery and humiliation from our key values. So-called set of values, amending set of values, Madam Speaker, related to the family, so-called orthodox values of the family, and our points that everyone have right to have their sexual orientation. It's everything fake.
Thank you,
It's against the freedom. I would like to congratulate Mr. Omczyk and say that it was a great report, and we endorse you from all our heart and from all our soil, saying that it was a key point. Democracy stopped to exist. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zingeris. Our next speaker is Mr. Maria Metsentseva.
Thank you, dear President. Colleagues, I would like to start with statistics. We're now talking about the person who actually influenced each and every person's life in this room, outside of the hall, and in the whole world. The UN calculated that the war of aggression of Russia and Putin himself, because he planned it and executed it since 2014 against Ukraine, 2008 against Georgia, back in the days against Ichkeria and many other countries. It has influenced 1.8 billion people in 94 countries across the globe. It brought under a question the security of food distribution. And President Zelensky thanked to our assembly yesterday publicly on Twitter, and I thank you all for recognizing the great famine of the last century against Ukraine by the Stalin Soviet regime, which is called Holodomor, which brought millions of Ukrainians to starvation, which could brought also millions of the people across the globe to starvation, because the regime of Putin, who is a dictator, as the rapporteur, brave Peter Omczyk, is suggesting us to consider, as well as his dictatorship regime, which is illegitimate, is Putin a threat not only under the question of security. The security dimension today is very wide. But I want to say that it's extremely important to say that ECHR court ruling said the aggression started in 2014, including the illegal attempt of occupation of Crimea, the illegal actions that were done as an act of aggression against other territories of Ukraine in Donbass and currently in other parts. Also, the downing of the flight MH17, which brought so many victims. They were in our hall at various sittings of the plenary, but those families can be felt and heard, I think, only by Ukrainians, because we share the same emotions and tragedy. We were crying out about that since 2015 when it happened, and the assembly was doubting whether actually the Russian forces are to be blamed for. Indeed, colleagues, the very exhaustive report, even though it's very short, but it targets the core thing. Putin is a dictator, his regime is illegitimate, and we have a beautiful answer and solution to that. Only international tribunal for the crime of aggression, which is widely supported by your governments, in the core group, an international investigative group being placed in The Hague already. The next meeting of the core group is in Berlin in November, will be an answer and will be a legitimate answer to the regime of Putin, him, and around 20 people of his team in the possible court and jail. We're looking forward for it to be supported widely and for justice to be at place. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Metsentseva. Our next speaker is Mrs. Ustinova.
Dear colleagues, I think we should not be even talking about Vladimir Putin as the president of Russian Federation, because he is a criminal. So the first thing we should be discussing is how he should be brought to justice. And a lot of his puppets who started wars, not only in Ukraine, but in a lot of the parts of the world. Second, he is a FSB agent, just like a lot of Russians outside of the country working for a machine to keep this regime. And not only to keep this regime in Russia, but to share this, to spread this regime to other European nations, to other democracies, and to ruin them. Putin is a bully. He cannot be negotiated. He doesn't understand the words of democracy. He doesn't understand our values. It's not that he's not sharing that. He just doesn't understand that the world can be different. This person understands only one thing, responsibility, and that's why he has to be brought to court, and he has to end up facing all the consequences of everything he has done in the world, with millions of people being killed, starved, and to be honest, I think this is only the beginning. He's the bully who understands only weapons and strength. And we should be united now, not only saying that he is not a legitimate president of Russia, because he is not, and this is obvious for everyone. We should be united in stopping this person basically ruining democracies in the Western world. What is weird is he is the person who is trying to undermine democracies in the world. He is trying to put his puppets and his fake governments in other countries. He is putting a lot of money in his propaganda, and unfortunately, we can see it now here in Europe. My colleague was telling you yesterday that France 24 was showing Prigozhin and Wagner groups saying we have PTSD. PTSD, people who raped women, who killed people around the world, who are Russian terrorist group. Now they're claiming that they have PTSD and they have difficulties to leave. And this is the Russia propaganda that we are being fed with. And the second thing, which is important, he's trying to undermine democracies, putting a lot of money in the extreme rights movements, ideologies, trying to ruin the democracies from inside. So I think this is a very important report that everyone should support. But I think this report should be only the beginning in bringing Putin to the court in Hague, and not only him, but a lot of people who are sitting next to him, millions of Russians who are in Единая Россия, which is a criminal party that is ruling Russia now. And those are more than 2 million people. We should be talking about them as well, because they're the one who is supporting this regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ustinova. Our next speaker is Monsieur Bergeron. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, chers collègues. L'illégitimité et l'illégalité de la guerre d'agression que mène la Russie en Ukraine sont exposées un peu plus clairement chaque fois que nous en débattons dans cette Assemblée. Aujourd'hui, c'est la légitimité et la légalité même du mandat de celui qui en est ultimement responsable qui se trouve sous la loupe de notre Assemblée. La Commission de Venise a conclu sans équivoque que la dérogation ad hominem à la limitation des mandats du président en exercice viole à la fois la Constitution russe et les principes juridiques internationaux. Rappelons-nous qu'après ses 2 premiers mandats, Poutine a fait semblant de respecter la Constitution de son pays en prêtant temporairement la présidence à Dmitri Medvedev. Cependant, les élections de 2012 et 2018 remportées par Poutine étaient pour ainsi dire des simulacres d'élections libres et démocratiques, de même que le référendum de 2020 sur lequel se fondent les modifications constitutionnelles lui ayant permis de s'accrocher au pouvoir jusqu'en 2036 et que l'opposant Alexeï Navalny, aujourd'hui emprisonné après qu'on ait littéralement tenté de l'assassiner, a qualifié d'énormes mensonges. Comme le note le rapporteur Peter Omtzig, la répression brutale contre les opposants internes tels que messieurs Navalny, Nemtsov et Karamurza et la guerre d'agression contre l'Ukraine illustre le coût croissant de l'absence de contre-pouvoir en Russie. D'ailleurs, à propos de l'Ukraine, non seulement Poutine a-t-il violé les accords de Minsk, mais également le mémorandum de Budapest par lequel la Russie devait se porter garante de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine en échange de l'abandon par cette dernière de son arsenal nucléaire. La Russie aurait-elle manœuvré pour que l'Ukraine se départisse de son arsenal nucléaire de telle sorte de pouvoir mieux l'attaquer par la suite? La question se pose. Quelques jours avant d'entreprendre son invasion illégale et injustifiée de l'Ukraine, le président Poutine prétendait encore qu'aucune guerre n'était dans ses plans. Combien de manquements répétés à la parole donnée? On connaît la suite funeste. D'ailleurs, la Cour pénale internationale a déjà émis des mandats d'arrêt, entre autres, contre Vladimir Poutine pour des crimes de guerre odieux déportation et transferts illégaux de populations, principalement des enfants, de l'Ukraine vers la Russie. Dans son rapport, M. Omtzig rappelle avec raison que les 123 États partis au statut de Rome sur la Cour pénale internationale, dont le Canada, ont l'obligation juridique d'exécuter ces mandats d'arrêt si Poutine devait se trouver sur leur territoire. Je tiens à souligner au passage que l'Arménie a récemment exprimé l'intention de joindre à la Cour pénale internationale, et ce, même si Moscou, qui a lamentablement failli à ses obligations envers Yerevan, l'enjoint instamment de ne pas aller de l'avant. La résolution contenue dans le rapport réaffirme également le soutien à la création d'un tribunal pénal international ad hoc pour l'agression contre l'Ukraine, crime qui a permis la commission de tous les autres crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité dont s'est rendue coupable la Russie. Assurons-nous que ce tribunal soit créé et qu'il ait les moyens de mener à bien son mandat de telle sorte que les responsables de ces crimes répondent de leurs actes et que nous puissions travailler ensemble à la reconstruction de la Russie et de l'Europe de l'après-Poutine sans devoir attendre après 2036. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci à vous, Monsieur Bergeron. Our next speaker is Mr. Merensko, and our last speaker will be Mr. Sobolev.
Thank you. Dear friends, remember the question which was asked when the Kremlin dictator had been only starting his bloody and genocidal career. The question was, who is Mr. Putin? Now we all know the answer to this question. First of all, Putin is a war criminal, and the International Criminal Court has already issued an arrest warrant for him. Second, Putin is a terrorist. The PACE, in one of its resolutions, had recognized Russia as a terrorist regime, and it logically implies that the head of this terrorist regime is a terrorist himself, and he should be recognized as such. Thirdly, Putin is a dictator, and again, the PACE has recognized Russia as a dictatorship. Thus, Putin should be treated by all member states of the Council of Europe as a war criminal and as a terrorist. It means that there should be no diplomatic relations between democratic states and the terrorist regime. War criminal and terrorist Putin should be completely isolated, just like terrorist state Russia itself. At the same time, Putin is only a part of the problem the world now faces. The other part of the problem is Russia itself. We should openly recognize that by its very nature, Russia is a colonial empire, and as such, it should be subjected to decolonization. Without Russia's decolonization, the Europe and the world security cannot be guaranteed. If Russia remains colonial empire, the world will continue to be in danger. Recently, someone in PACE decided to create a platform for communication with the so-called Russian democratic opposition and civic society in Russia. I suppose that it's a bad idea, because Russia is a totalitarian state, and there is no civic society in Russia. Besides, even Russian liberal opposition wants to retain Russia as a colonial empire. Instead of this platform, dear friends, I would like to suggest creation of another platform, a platform for Russia's decolonization. In this platform could participate representatives of colonial nations which are struggling for their independence and freedom from Russian empire. I hope that you will consider my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meretsko. Now our last speaker, I call next Mr. Sobolev.
Thank you. I want, of course, to say my big thanks to the rapporteur, Mr. Omtzig. I think that he started a very serious theme. It's only the beginning of our discussion, because everybody understands that it's not only about Putin and about Russia. It's a more wide theme. This report is about checks and balances, and about the future of Europe and the future of the world. The end of Russian Republic and the start of dictatorship of Putin, it's only one episode in the European security system. We must understand that our organization is also responsible for everything that we now have in Russia. From the first day when Russia became the member of this organization, we can analyze the reports of monitoring committee, other committees about situation in Russia. And only after the open invasion of Russia into Ukraine, after this, we began to name dictator, dictatorship, and we began to analyze everything that we have now in Russia. The system of checks and balances, it's not only a problem of Russia. It's a problem of other member states of Europe and of our organization. Because from the small events started a big dictatorship and big war. When Putin started his political career from the killing of thousands and thousands of his own citizenship, when he started his career from the wars, from death is blood, we must understand that our organization was also one of those who didn't stop him. And it's very important to analyze now, why is it possible? When we discussed yesterday the prevention of the wars in the world and in Europe especially, we discussed our status and our possibility to prevent the war. And the case of Putin and case of the end of republic in Russia, it's also the case that shows that when we are closing our eyes to such problems, it started from the small war, but it's no small war. Each war is a big war because it's a big tragedy to millions of peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sobolyev. Dear colleagues, I must now interrupt the list of speeches of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that typewritten text can be submitted electronically if possible, no later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. Now I call Mr. Omzik, reporter, to reply. You have 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. And this is not much of a debate because it seems that we all seem to agree on a few basic tenets. And I would like to underline the words of Mrs. Sobolyev. This is not just about Putin. This is happening in more parts of Europe. There are more parts of Europe where dictatorships do exist, and whereas we as an organization of democratic nations have looked away for too long. Mr. Gavin pointed to Mr. Aliyev. Their dictatorship even seems to run in the family. And there we have the same problem. That is, someone is there too long, he starts actions, and these actions were in Nagorno-Karabakh over the last few weeks. So it is once all the checks and balances fall away in your states, you go on the wrong path. And that's why I think we should have a follow-up at some point to this report. That we should consider something like an addition to the European Convention on Human Rights or anything. That term limits are an essential part of democracy. Now, I propose in my report twice 4 or 5 years is the maximum. If it's twice 6 years, it's okay. But somewhere it has to end, especially when you have a presidential republic. Now, other speakers, Mr. Speaker, turn to the question of what to do with Mr. Putin. Bring him to court. He's very welcome in the city where I was born, in The Hague. And I really support what Ms. Kluiter said. Please also take MH17, Crimea, Donbass and everything starting in 2014 into account. That's also the last sentence of the resolution. And take it from there. But may I tell you something? The reason we're here is because we haven't shown resolve between 2014 and 2022. We've all let this go on happening. We didn't stop when there were 2 wars in Chechnya. We did not stop when he invaded Georgia and annexed South Ossetia and Abkhazia. We did not stop when he went into Crimea. We did not do much when he entered Donbass. And because we waited so late on the day, we're now paying a high price. And if we, as a community of democratic nations, remain unwilling to pay a price, even to ourselves, that we have to pay something to defend our human rights, then we're not willing to defend the values. So we have to show a lot of resolve, and let's start with really adopting this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Omtzigt. Does the chairperson of the committee, Mr. Damir Kotier, wish to speak? It seems so. You have the floor.
Oui, merci Madame la Présidente. Une chose n'est pas juste parce qu'elle est loi, mais elle doit être loi parce qu'elle est juste. Charles-Louis de Secondat, baron de Montesquieu. J'avais envie de commencer par cette citation parce que c'est bien de cela dont on parle aujourd'hui. Le rapporteur l'a extrêmement bien précisé. Il s'agit de la séparation des pouvoirs, checks and balances. Le rapport de M. Omtzigt est basé sur un travail sérieux, d'abord celui de la Commission de Venise, à laquelle la Commission a demandé un avis. Et ensuite, au sein de la Commission elle-même, nous avons notamment auditionné la présidente de la Commission de Venise et sa secrétaire générale. L'avis de la Commission de Venise, cité in extenso, a été préparé avec la coopération des autorités russes, dont les arguments ont été pris en compte par la Commission de Venise, mais sans pour autant la convaincre. La proposition de résolution a été lancée, cela a été précisé bien avant l'invasion massive russe de l'Ukraine au début de l'année dernière, mais les craintes exprimées dans ce texte se sont malheureusement avérées lucides. Les dictatures finissent, hélas, par devenir des menaces, pas seulement pour leur propre peuple, sa liberté, sa prospérité, mais aussi pour leurs voisins. Et à l'inverse, les historiens ont donné la réponse à la question posée tout à l'heure par M. Bergeron. À l'inverse, on constate que les démocraties ne se font pas la guerre. Et c'est un constat extrêmement important. On voit donc que les checks and balances, ou la séparation des pouvoirs, pour reprendre les mots de Montesquieu, dans un système hyper présidentiel comme en Russie, mais pas seulement, ont tendance à éroder avec le temps. Le président finit par nommer lui-même toutes celles et ceux qui devraient le contrôler. Au fond, il est entouré d'amis ou d'alliés. Il sera de plus en plus séparé de la réalité du pays. Et on voit le résultat en Russie. La démocratie et l'état de droit ont reculé au point qu'on peut constater que ce pays est devenu une dictature, malheureusement. Il n'y a plus de vraie opposition parlementaire, plus de justice indépendante, plus de médias libres, plus de société civile active. Et ce sont justement les contre-pouvoirs que les autorités russes elles-mêmes ont cités devant la Commission de Venise comme justifiant le fait qu'il y a suffisamment de contre-pouvoirs, même s'il n'y a pas de limite à la durée du mandat présidentiel. Or, on voit que cela ne fonctionne pas. De fait, la Commission doit donc constater qu'il y a une violation de la Constitution de la Fédération de Russie, de principes internationaux importants et que, par conséquent, le mandat du président de la Fédération de Russie actuel deviendra illégitime à la fin de son mandat actuel. Madame la Présidente, permettez-moi de remercier le rapporteur pour son excellent travail qui a le plein soutien de la Commission et le temps qu'il y a consacré, alors qu'on sait qu'il est aussi occupé actuellement par quelques autres affaires. Et comme c'est la dernière fois que je m'exprime devant la plénière en tant que président de la Commission des affaires juridiques et des droits de l'homme, permettez-moi de dire que cela a été un privilège. J'aimerais remercier les membres de la Commission, les nombreux experts qui nous ont aidés à travailler et le secrétariat pour son travail toujours excellent. Je vous remercie.
Merci à toi, Damien. The debate is closed now. The Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution to which 4 amendments have been tabled and 2 sub-amendments. I understand that the chairperson of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 1 and 2 to the draft resolution, which were unanimously approved by committee, should be declared as agreed by the Assembly. Is that right, Damien Cotier?
I can confirm, je confirme.
Does anyone object? It's not the case. As there is no objection, I declare that Amendment 1 and 2 to the draft resolution has been agreed. So I call Mr. Goncharenko to support Amendment 3. You have 30 seconds.
Yes, Putin is dictator, but also Putin is dictator, but also Putin is killer, Putin is criminal. That is said by International Criminal Court, and here we are saying about the wars which Putin started, Chechen wars with genocide of Chechens, Transnistria, Georgia, as illustrative examples. And I think it's very important to call Putin who he is: dictator, killer, criminal.
Does anyone wish to speak against the sub-amendment? But I had to give the word to you, Mr. Omtzig, on behalf of the committee. Please.
Well, there is a sub-amendment to Amendment 3. The sub-amendment is not to enhance its domestic image, but to enhance the president's domestic image. It's a clarification. That's why we're voting on it. So I would like to support that sub-amendment, which was approved unanimously by the committee.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I don't see anyone else who wants to say something. So, what is the opinion of the of the main amendment, Mr. Kocharenko?
I completely support oral sub-amendment. Thank you.
The committee is obviously in favor. I will now put the sub-amendments to the vote. The vote is open. Now the vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Congratulations, the sub-amendment is adopted. Now we will consider the main amendment as sub-amendment. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? No. And what is the opinion of the committee?
Madam Speaker, the committee supported the amendment as sub-amended unanimously.
Thank you very much. I shall now put Amendment 3 to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the results. Display. Yes, it's also adopted. Now I call Ms. Enseva to support Amendment 4. You have 30 seconds.
Yes, thank you, President. The philosophy of Amendment 4 is to state that the Assembly calls on the member states to recognize Vladimir Putin and his government as illegitimate after his current term, and to restrict all the further contexts except those which touch upon humanitarian issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I call Mr. Omtzing on behalf of the committee to support the sub-amendment.
Thank you. The sub-amendment reads, it changes it on 4 points, so I read it out. The Assembly calls on the Member States of the Council of Europe to recognize Vladimir Putin as illegitimate after the end of his current presidential term and to cease all contact with him except for humanitarian contact and the pursuit of peace. So we make a few changes. We say we should not finish recognizing his government. It is Mr. Putin as president, not his government. And we should not restrict the contact, we should seize them, except for two things: humanitarian contact, what the mover wanted, and the pursuit of peace. So if you have to sign a peace deal, then he needs to be able to sign it as the president.
Thank you very much. Does anyone wish to speak against the sub-amendment? And what is the opinion of the mover of the main amendment, Mrs. Mezentseva?
Well, friends, I don't know, we're not in the peace talks yet. We are aiming for peace, but it's not happening right now. Peace and the future, yes, in the yesterday's resolution we restated pursuit of peace. Then let's add under Ukrainian terms, but I don't know. It appears in a strange reason for me. Sorry, I don't know.
Thank you very much. I see now the chair, Damien Cotier, who wants to say something. Please, you have the floor.
Yes, Madam Speaker, just to inform the Assembly that the committee supported the sub-amendment unanimously. He sees it as an improvement, and he supported the amendment as sub-amended also unanimously.
Thank you very much. Now I will put the sub-amendments to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. And I call the result, yes, the sub-amendment is adopted. We'll now consider the main amendment. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? So, not the case. What is the and what is the committee's opinion on the amendment?
As I just mentioned, Madam Chair, the committee supported unanimously the amendment as sub-amended.
Thank you very much. I shall now put Amendment 4 as sub-amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. So it's also adopted. Thank you very much. We will now proceed to the vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15827. As amended, a simple majority is required. Now the vote is open. The vote is closed. The draft resolution is unanimously approved. Congratulations. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. So we are going, let's see in a few minutes.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. L'ordre du jour appelle, dans le cadre d'un débat conjoint, la présentation de la discussion de deux rapports de la Commission des questions sociales, de la santé et du développement durable. Nous entendrons d'abord la présentation de M. Simon Moutquin du rapport de Mme Diana Stoica, sur prévenir les comportements addictifs chez l'enfant. C'est le document 15830. Ensuite, M. Simon Moutquin présentera son rapport sur la santé mentale et le bien-être des enfants et des jeunes adultes. Nous devrons en avoir terminé avec l'examen de ce texte, vote inclus, à 12h15. Nous devrons donc interrompre la liste des orateurs vers 12h, afin de pouvoir entendre la réplique de la Commission et de procéder au vote nécessaire. Monsieur Simon Moutquin dispose d'un temps de parole de 10 minutes pour la présentation des deux rapports et de 6 minutes pour répondre aux orateurs à la fin de la discussion générale. La parole est à M. Simon Mutka, s'il vous plaît.
Merci Madame la Présidente, merci à toutes et à tous d'être restés un vendredi matin de fin de session très chargé. Je voudrais d'abord excuser Madame Stoïka qui malheureusement est malade pour l'instant et lui envoyer toute mon amitié et un bon rétablissement. Donc je vais en effet commencer par présenter son rapport qui traitait des comportements addictifs chez les enfants avant de vous parler de la santé mentale et du bien-être des enfants et des adultes. Le rapport de Madame Stoïka, il part d'un postulat de départ qui est important. Il y a une vraie inquiétude aujourd'hui face à un comportement addictif qui augmente, à des comportements addictifs qui augmentent chez les enfants et toute une série de conséquences sur la santé mentale et physique de leur développement. Il y a des nouvelles drogues sur notre continent, dans nos pays, dans les États membres. Il y a des nouvelles drogues qui représentent un vrai danger pour les enfants. Mais il y a aussi toute la question du numérique, notamment les paris en ligne, les jeux vidéo, qui représentent aussi des comportements addictifs pour les enfants. Et puis il y a eu cette pandémie du Covid qui nous a frappés et qui a montré aussi que les comportements addictifs avaient augmenté chez les enfants et qu'une certaine inefficacité des mesures en place était existante. Or, comme le rappelle Madame la rapporteuse, chaque enfant a le droit à une vie saine conformément à la Convention des Nations Unies et aux objectifs du développement durable, à savoir l'objectif numéro 3. Le comportement addictif chez les enfants ne se limite pas à la consommation de substances, mais elle inclut aussi, comme je l'ai dit, les jeux vidéo, les jeux en ligne, ce qui provoque notamment un endettement financier, une détresse psychologique. Alors, qu'est-ce qui finalement fait qu'un jeune va être attiré par des comportements addictifs? Madame Stoïka l'explique très bien. Alors c'est sûr qu'il y a une partie de vouloir faire comme les autres, vouloir avoir l'air cool, mais ce serait vraiment une faiblesse intellectuelle de résumer des comportements addictifs à ça. En réalité, il y a plein d'autres facteurs qui font qu'aujourd'hui, des jeunes peuvent être attirés par certaines substances ou par une addiction aux jeux en ligne. Par exemple, parmi ces facteurs, il y a certains traumatismes, il y a le harcèlement en ligne, il y a les questions de maltraitance, il y a les conflits familiaux. Et puis, un facteur qui est vraiment important, c'est le facteur intergénérationnel, notamment en termes d'alcoolisme et d'assuétude. Je pense que c'est un facteur qui est assez important. Alors, quelles conséquences? Elles sont très importantes, ces conséquences, vous vous en doutez, des conséquences sur la santé physique des jeunes. On sait les liens entre santé mentale et santé physique, mais aussi des problèmes de décrochage scolaire, des problèmes de troubles neurodéveloppementaux. Des conséquences très graves, bien sûr, en termes de dépendance, c'est le principe de l'addiction, mais aussi d'endettement et d'isolement social qui entraîne un cycle vicieux, puisque l'isolement social peut encore entraîner une augmentation des addictions. Alors, Madame Stoïka propose des solutions qui, de manière générale, doivent être intégrées, qui doivent impliquer les patients et leur entourage, mettre en place des thérapies individuelles, familiales, ainsi que des soutiens médicaux lorsque nécessaire. Sur les drogues dites classiques, il y a toute une série de mesures à mettre en place, avoir une approche holistique comme le propose le rapport de Madame Stoïka, avoir une coopération internationale sur les statistiques, les données qui sont connues et surtout, et j'en parlerai dans quelques secondes aussi dans le cadre de mon rapport, avoir un volet important sur la prévention. Les enfants doivent être impliqués directement dans la prévention. Sur l'addiction numérique, il faut vraiment avoir un dialogue avec cette plateforme numérique, avec ces sites internet, avec l'industrie du numérique pour interdire notamment des publicités pour l'alcool ou les drogues. C'est le cas parfois, même des drogues synthétiques sur certains sites internet. Alors aussi des campagnes de prévention, bien sûr, sur les réseaux sociaux. Voilà ce qui termine ma brève présentation du rapport de Madame Stoïka. Et maintenant, je vais vous parler de mon rapport sur une prise en compte de l'impact de la lutte contre la pandémie du Covid-19 sur la santé mentale et des mineurs et des jeunes adultes. Alors, c'était le titre initial et je vais vous expliquer pourquoi on a voulu changer de titre. J'ai été nommé rapporteur donc, sur ce titre en février 2021 avec 29 autres membres de l'Assemblée que je remercie. Et ce rapport avait pour but d'étudier finalement les liens entre les mesures sanitaires, les mesures de confinement et une dégradation de la santé mentale des jeunes. Ce rapport devait appeler les États membres à prendre finalement des mesures proportionnelles et proportionnées pour protéger les jeunes. Et puis nous avons fait avec la Commission un voyage, un terrain passionnant en Norvège, où on s'est rendu compte, notamment via ce terrain, mais aussi en auditionnant des jeunes, que la situation des jeunes était bien plus grave qu'uniquement, la situation mentale des jeunes était bien plus grave qu'uniquement la limiter au Covid-19. Je voudrais d'abord vous donner une définition de la santé mentale. La santé mentale, selon l'ONU, c'est un état de bien-être mental qui nous permet d'affronter les sources de stress de vie, de réaliser notre potentiel, de bien apprendre et de bien travailler et de contribuer à la vie en communauté. Cette définition est tout à fait importante. Il y a eu des grandes évolutions ces dernières années qui finalement font le lien entre santé mentale et santé physique, et je pense qu'il faut remercier tous les chercheurs qui ont pu montrer l'importance de la santé mentale et la mettre finalement au même niveau que la santé physique. Alors la santé mentale, c'est une définition que je viens de donner, mais c'est avant tout un droit. C'est un droit qui est reconnu par notre charte sociale européenne, par exemple. C'est un droit qui est reconnu par les Nations Unies, par la Convention d'élimination de toute forme de discrimination à l'égard des femmes notamment et des enfants, et par d'innombrables textes internationaux. L'importance de la santé mentale chez les jeunes, il faut bien se rendre compte que, vous le savez, la jeunesse, c'est une période de la vie où on se construit physiquement d'abord, on se construit aussi en termes de réseaux sociaux, d'amitié, on se construit en termes d'amour, et donc c'est vraiment une période dans laquelle des troubles de santé mentale peuvent avoir un impact très important. Je reviens quelque peu sur la question de la crise sanitaire. On le sait, les périodes de confinement, puisque c'était initialement le sujet de mon rapport, les périodes de confinement ont un impact direct sur la santé mentale. Isolement, bouleversement des habitudes, deuil, incertitude ont eu des impacts dévastateurs sur beaucoup de jeunes. Et d'ailleurs, l'OMS parle d'une augmentation de 25% des périodes d'anxiété chez les jeunes et les jeunes adultes pendant le Covid-19. Ensuite, il faut bien se rendre compte que cette question du confinement a aussi eu un impact finalement sur des jeunes qui avaient déjà des problèmes de santé mentale, qui ont en fait vu leurs problèmes s'aggraver et parfois l'accès à des traitements rendus difficiles par les mesures de confinement. Mais faisons un peu des constats aujourd'hui en dehors du Covid. Aujourd'hui, la santé mentale des jeunes se dégrade pour toute une série de raisons. Et regardons un peu notre société. Crise financière, crise énergétique, conflits à travers le monde, et je pense que cette semaine nous a montré que ces conflits étaient importants. La triple crise climatique avec une augmentation de ce qu'on appelle l'éco-anxiété, aussi sans doute une société méritocratique, une société qui met la pression sur les jeunes, une société où il y a une perte de sens dans le travail, fait que toutes ces mesures-là et toutes ces raisons-là, tous ces facteurs-là font qu'aujourd'hui les jeunes sont dans une réelle souffrance. Et je voudrais rappeler qu'aujourd'hui le suicide est la deuxième cause de mortalité chez les jeunes, que la dépression et l'anxiété sont les deux causes principales de maladies chez les jeunes. Et elles sont souvent déclarées notamment en raison des stigmatisations qui sont autour des problèmes de santé mentale. Aujourd'hui, 13% des 10-19 ans sont atteints de troubles de santé mentale. Alors, quelles conséquences, vous vous en doutez? Il y a une explosion à l'exclusion sociale, il y a une discrimination qui s'installe, il y a des stigmatisations, il y a une santé physique qui est aussi impactée par la santé mentale. On pense que c'est souvent dans un sens, mais en réalité, c'est dans les deux sens. Et puis, ça entraîne bien sûr tout simplement une violation des droits humains. Alors, j'ai pu me rendre, comme je l'ai dit, en Norvège. Alors, vous savez, la Norvège est souvent citée comme l'un des États membres sans doute les plus exemplaires en termes d'accès à la santé tout court, aux soins de santé, mais aussi aux soins de santé mentaux. En effet, en Norvège, on a pu remarquer qu'il y avait une couverture finalement d'accès à toute une série de centres, depuis les quartiers, même des quartiers et tant mieux précarisés, jusqu'à dans les écoles. Il y a vraiment une possibilité d'avoir accès à un psychologue qui est vraiment importante. Il y a toute une série de choses qui sont mises en place. Il y a un apprentissage dans les écoles des sujets, des données autour de la santé mentale dès le plus jeune âge. Il y a des lignes téléphoniques qui sont mises en place notamment pour pouvoir confier des choses, mais il y a aussi des limites. On a vu par exemple que certaines lignes téléphoniques, notamment pour les personnes LGBT, avaient eu quelques restrictions de budget, et je pense qu'une des recommandations de mon rapport, c'est justement d'éviter de réduire ces offres, mais au contraire les augmenter. En tout cas, j'en profite pour remercier la délégation norvégienne et les deux collègues de l'Assemblée que j'ai pu rencontrer à Oslo. Alors, une des conclusions finalement de cette mission en Norvège de terrain, mais aussi du rapport, c'est que la pandémie n'a pas seulement aggravé les problèmes de santé mentale, elle a juste mis en évidence la fragilité des systèmes de prise en charge et montré que ces épreuves touchaient de manière disproportionnée les communautés les plus défavorisées. Et avec les 40 secondes qui me restent, je vais vous donner quelques exemples de recommandations que mon rapport fait. Il fait des recommandations sur 3 niveaux finalement. Des recommandations sur le système de santé mentale, comment le rendre plus solide, notamment en mettant en place des possibilités de consultation, de concertation de psychologues de manière décentrée. Il y a toute une série de mesures qui concernent finalement je vous ai parlé de la société qui ne faisait pas rêver beaucoup de jeunes pour l'instant, et donc comment faire en sorte que cette société soit moins inégalitaire et plus accessible. Et puis enfin, il y a des mesures en cas de nouveau confinement, ce que je ne nous souhaite pas collectivement, il y a des mesures à prendre en place, il y a des précautions à prendre en place pour les jeunes et d'ailleurs les moins jeunes qui doivent être absolument dites dans ce rapport, qui sont notées dans ce rapport. Voilà, je resterai sur des conclusions peut-être plus personnelles après vos interventions. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur le rapporteur. Merci, Simon. Dans la discussion générale, on passe aux orateurs au nom des groupes politiques. Et la parole est à Madame Maria Sirenguela de la Grèce, qui parle au nom du groupe PPE.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, as a new member of PACE, it is a great honor not only to stand in front of you, but also to represent EPP today. Mental health, especially of children and young people, is at the top of our agenda the recent years, must be at the top of our agenda the recent years. The COVID-19 pandemic, along with its lockdowns, brought a new area to our societies. Mental health and social relationship became fragile for both the younger and the older people. The consequences of the lockdowns, combined with the easier access to various substances, the uncontrolled freedom of the internet, and socioeconomic difficulties, created unprecedented challenges to the development of our children. Mental health issues existed prior to the pandemic, of course. As it is explained in the reports, financial crisis, peer pressure, and climate crisis also affect the mental state of children and teens who present high anxiety. As a result, in Europe, suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people, a statistic which not only frightens us, but also mobilizes us to act immediately. Mental health is strongly connected with addictive behaviours in children, an issue which does not recognise borders and impacts on the very fabric of our societies. All countries of Europe member states are parties of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which guarantees that every child has the right to a healthy life. So it is our duty, not only as politicians, but as mothers, fathers, aunts and uncles, to ensure a healthier and more prosperous future for our children. The danger is here. For substance and tobacco addiction to online gaming or screen addiction, they all share a common target: children and adolescents. As Mr. Stoica reported, it is urgent for the Council of Europe member states to set up tools which help prevent the use by children of the main substances, to develop comprehensive protective measures geared to various addictive behaviours, and to identify long-term responses to new trends in addictive behaviours in keeping with the child's best interest. At the same time, Mr. Mutqueen reports that we need to enhance promotion, prevention and early intervention strategies to ensure that mental health care services are free and accessible to everyone, to encourage youth participation in democratic procedures, to make the voice of young people heard and make them feel valued and understood. Last but not least, tackling child poverty should be high in our agendas in order to holistically combat this issue. Dear colleagues, the challenges we face in preventing addictive behaviours cannot be limited by national borders. It is imperative to unite our powers, to collaborate at the European and international level, to share good practice and develop effective strategies. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Au nom du groupe ADLE, la parole est à Madame Julia Oshinikova. Vous avez la parole, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Dear colleagues, dear Rapporteurs Assembly. First of all, thank you very much for your really excellent work to our rapporteur. It's really brilliant work. So mental health and mental well-being of children and young people is one of the vital and even core topics for the future of Europe. Pandemic brought a shift in how mental well-being is being handled and treated in our societies and globally. And a human rights-based approach is the core of the public debate and policies. On behalf of the ALDE group, I want to stress a few issues. First, International and national statistics reveal a troubling increase in mental health issues among children and youth, including depression, anxiety, other psychological disorders, and even suicidal thoughts and attempts. Comprehensive, accessible, and free or affordable mental health services and support should be ensured across Europe. Relevant policies and changes in the healthcare and education systems should be immediately implemented. Second, the pace has already shown commendable foresight and acknowledging and significance of safeguarding the mental health of children and young adults. Also stressing the need to create an environment conducive to their psychological well-being and to ensure access to highly quality mental health services. 15 concrete recommendations formulated in the report will definitely help to improve the situation and care more effectively about the mental well-being of the future generations. Third, ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine and economic hardship have placed additional burdens on the mental health of Ukrainian children and youth, also those who became refugees in Europe and beyond. Exposure to violence, displacement, and loss of loved ones have contributed to higher rates and anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder among Ukrainian children. So to address these pressure issues, we must commit to expanding access to health care services, particularly to vulnerable populations, and prioritize the training of mental health professionals. We should also promote mental health education and awareness campaign to reduce the stigma surrounding mental health issues. So, colleagues, this topic is not only concern for individual states, but a collective responsibility, all of us. As we gather here today, let us reaffirm our commitment to working together across borders to ensure that every child and young adults, regardless to their nationality, can grow up an environment that nurtures their mental health and well-being. Thank you for your attention and dedication on these vital issues.
Merci beaucoup, Julia. Au nom du groupe CAD, la parole est à Madame Nihar Alpadaray de l'Azerbaïdjan. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our rapporteurs for this amazing work that they are doing. This subject is extremely important. Dear colleagues, studies say that worldwide 10% of children and adolescents have mental disorders. Suicide now is the fourth leading cause of death in 15–19-year-old. There are many apparent reasons for that. Future is not certain and the present is stressful. But when it comes to mental health and prosperity of our children, the question that we need to ask is, do we adults do things right in this changing and challenging today? Is our schooling system adequate to the needs and realities of today? Is it protecting our children from mental health issues? Is there a chance that often it contributes to their multiplication instead of protecting them? The core design of schooling system assumes that whatever is said by teacher or taught in textbook is true. And if the status of impeccable moral authority is abused by some ideologically charged networks to promote purely political ideology, it's a crime and failure of the schooling system. The criminalization of drugs in the legal domain is apparent, but what is worse is a direct and indirect propaganda of drugs on TV and in the media. A lot of this propaganda is aimed at children and teenagers. Drugs are evil, and they should remain this way because they kill. Schools, in this aspect, must be a safe place. But to the contrary, there is a tendency of schooling system turning into a place where antidepressants and very dubious psychotherapeutic practices are putting our children under increased risk. We need to think about that. Schools must never become a lab for big pharma. COVID brought its own impact. Schools largely failed this exam during the COVID pandemic by introducing quarantines and forcing vaccines on children who did not need them. If risk for a child with COVID is negligible, if the vaccine is not stopping the spread of disease and only affects the severity of it, if natural immunity works better than vaccine, then why did we force this experimental practice on so many children? I'm still not aware of any meaningful investigation or any instances of accountability in this regard. I commend the report, however, for stressing the damage children suffered as a result of lengthy closures of schools during COVID and call to avoid it when possible. The effect that online reality has on mental health of our child is another endless topic. Our children already live online. And frankly, the adults have very little idea about this world of theirs, and we are going to know even less on it in the years to come. The internet gap between adults and children is growing with an amazing speed. And this huge disruption means a lot of risks for mental health of children. Do we have any meaningful plan to deal with it? I seriously doubt it. The most obvious and established social tool for protection of mental health of our children is family. Paraphrasing Churchill, one of the founding fathers of this esteemed assembly, I would like to remind that family as a social construct and the tool to protect our children is not perfect. Families and parents fail children too, but it is the best system we got so far. If we want to support children's mental health, one of the best ways to do is to enforce family and its values. And this should also be stressed in the report. Thank you very much for the reports.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Au nom du groupe GUE, la parole est à Madame Natasha Suric de la Slovénie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today's debate addresses an extremely pressing issue of our time. We are talking about children, but it is a problem that affects all levels of modern societies in particular. In the age of the internet, the enormous flow of information, the proliferation of social networks that bombard us daily with images of perfection, of social networks, of perfection in an otherwise world of growing crisis, conflicts, and uncertainty about the future, young people are a particularly vulnerable group. There is a wide range of theories on the causes of addiction in young people, but no clear consensus. The fact is that young people resort to substances whether out of a desire for perfection, despair, and anxiety, or simply a desire to experiment and be in, is a dangerous phenomenon. In an age of time, scarcity, and increasing disorientation, the true extent of which we will probably only be known in time. But that is what addiction is all about, the causes. Without properly addressing them, we can forever just treat until the problem is too big for there to be an effective amount of cure. We are talking about the problem that requires an interdisciplinary approach. The first and most important level is, of course, the family environment, but unfortunately, this is also far too often reason for children's use of illicit substances and for the addictive behavior of children and adolescents. It is therefore essential to involve all levels of society and the profession, health and education professionals, the media, civil society, business and politics, to name but a few segments. However, tackling this problem requires first and foremost the involvement of young people, which is why the call also enshrined in the resolutions and the recommendation for the need to empower children and adolescents to involve them in the process of finding solutions is to be firmly supported. It is extremely important to start the conversation with them at an early age, to help them acquire the tools to build healthy relationships, first with themselves and then with their environment to maintain mental health and balance. As a society, we need to learn how to actively listen to children, resisting the urge to lecture, but actively engaging them in the search for shared answers. I agree with the rapporteur, Mr. Motkan, that mental health and well-being are fundamental components of a child's healthy development and future. And since children are our future, we are talking about the mental health of our society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Au nom du groupe socialiste, la parole est à Madame Eichen-Engelhardt de l'Allemagne. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, dear colleagues. Gesundheitlich, ganzheitlich denken und das psychische Wohl von Kindern und Jugendlichen in den Mittelpunkt zu rücken, das ist heute unser Thema. Ich danke den beiden KollegInnen Mulțumesc, Diana Stoica und Merci Simon Mutka für ihre wichtigen Beiträge. Denn sie zeigen ganz deutlich auf, dass Krisen wie die Corona-Pandemie, der russische Angriffskrieg gegen die Ukraine, ganz aktuell der Terror in Israel oder die Klimakrise viele jungen Menschen psychisch stark belasten. Dies müssen wir ernst nehmen und entsprechend darauf reagieren. Was können wir also tun? Wir müssen die gesundheitlichen Folgen der Pandemie auf die Kinder und Jugendlichen in unseren Mitgliedstaaten aufarbeiten. Und wir müssen Maßnahmen umsetzen, die ihnen bei der Bewältigung helfen. Für künftige Krisen müssen wir darauf vorbereitet sein, die besonderen Bedarfe von Kindern und Jugendlichen noch besser zu berücksichtigen. Gleichzeitig brauchen wir mehr Präventionsarbeit in Kitas und Schulen, in der Kinder- und Jugend- und Familienhilfe oder in gesundheitlichen Einrichtungen. Dabei muss die Hilfe möglichst passgenau auf die verschiedenen Biografien der Betroffenen ausgelegt sein. Betroffene, die dringend Hilfe benötigen, dürfen nicht mehr Monate oder Jahre auf einen freien Therapieplatz warten müssen. Dies ist leider noch oft der Fall. Hier müssen zusätzlich alternative und niedrigschwellige Hilfsangebote geschaffen werden. Zudem muss das Thema psychische Gesundheit endlich aus der Tabuzone geholt werden. Liebe Kinder und Jugendliche, es ist kein Zeichen von Schwäche, wenn ihr BetreuerInnen, Eltern oder ÄrztInnen um Hilfe bittet. Es zeigt vielmehr euren Mut, für euch selbst und euer Wohlbefinden einzustehen. Kinder und Jugendliche flüchten sich zunehmend in Süchte, um der Einsamkeit und gefühlten Ohnmacht zu entkommen. Lassen Sie uns alle bitte nicht vergessen, wenn Kinder und Jugendliche mit einem Gefühl der Orientierungs- und Hoffnungslosigkeit alleine gelassen werden, wird das Auswirkungen auch auf die Zukunft unserer demokratischen Gesellschaften haben. Denn Demokratie lebt gerade von jungen Menschen, die sich einbringen, weil sie an ihre Selbstwirksamkeit glauben. In Zeiten multipler Krisen müssen wir dafür sorgen, dass junge Menschen das Gefühl beibehalten, ihre Zukunft politisch mitbestimmen zu können. Und dafür brauchen sie die notwendigen mentalen Kapazitäten. Vielen Dank.
Merci beaucoup. Après les orateurs au nom des groupes politiques, on passe à la liste des orateurs. Et la parole est à Pedro Segonho du Portugal. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Madam President, for the floor. First, I want to congratulate the rapporteurs for this work and for the draft resolutions and recommendations presented. Let me propose to look for a different perspective. How local authorities can also promote healthy lifestyles and prevent addictive behaviors in children through education, awareness, and community action. To illustrate the role of local and regional authorities in prevention and control of non-communicable diseases, which are often linked to addictive behaviors such as smoking, drinking, and unhealthy eating, we can also discuss the challenges and barriers that local authorities face in implementing effective policies and interventions, such as lack of resources, coordination and cooperation with other sectors and levels of government. The role of local authorities can also reduce the harm and crime associated with drugs addiction in children with prevention, treatment, and recovery services. We can see local authorities working with national and international partners to cut off the supply of drugs, support people with drug addiction to access treatment and recovery, and address the root of causes and consequences of drug addiction. We can also analyze the impact and the effectiveness of a plan on reducing drug-related harm and crime in local communities. On the other side, local authorities can also regulate the availability and the marketing of alcohol and other addictive substances to children through pricing policies, licensing schemes, and enforcement measures. In that example, we can demonstrate how local authorities can work with stakeholders from health, social care, justice, education, and community sectors to reduce the availability and demand of alcohol and drugs, especially among young people. We must always evaluate the outcomes and benefits of the partnership actions on improving health and well-being, reducing inequalities, and enhancing safety in the cities. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci beaucoup, Pedro. La parole est à Madame Lise Christoffersen de la Norvège, s'il vous plaît.
Madam President, dear colleagues, first, thank you to the rapporteur for focusing on mental health among young people and for pointing out necessary improvements to healthcare systems. I'm pleased to see Norway mentioned as an example of good practice. Still, we have a lot to do. In Norway, every year, approximately 650 people commit suicide. This is about 6 times as many as traffic deaths. Suicide numbers are higher than in the 1950s and 60s. The median age of suicide is 47. 2 out of 3 are male. Of young people under the age of 20, 30 to 40 die from suicide or because of intentional self-harm. Sadly, we see an increase in mental health problems among children. More than ever, young people are asking for mental health help, especially during and after the pandemic. The average life expectancy of people struggling with mental problems are 15 to 20 years shorter than others. Their quality of life is worse. Many eat and sleep badly, are less physically active, isolate themselves, and feel lonely. Anxiety, depression, psychosis, and eating disorders increase the risk of non-infectious physical illness like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, COPD, and cancer. Even if their health is poorer, it's a fact that mentally ill persons do not have the same access to physical treatment as others. Healthcare really needs to be more holistic and encompass both mental and physical health, as the rapporteur so correctly underlines. Our government is currently working on a new plan for mental health on all levels. They will strengthen prevention through a comprehensive public health perspective, extend low-threshold municipal services, as well as specialized treatment, improve interaction across different levels and professions, and simplify and improve reception and medical examination. Indeed, enforce prevention and low-threshold provisions at an early stage with a focus on children and young people will help to reduce mental health problems and suffering. Mental health care is not primarily about expensive medical equipment. It is just as much about access to and availability of professional expertise. New projections show a need to strengthen the number of employees by 15% until 2040. And that's another serious challenge we need to solve. The sooner, the better. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. La parole est à Monsieur Georgios Stamatis de la Grèce. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Madam President. Ευχαριστώ. Είμαι ιδιαίτερα ευτυχής που η πρώτη μου ομιλία ως μέλος του Συμβουλίου γίνεται για τα θέματα της ψυχικής υγείας και το θέμα των εξαρτήσεων. Επιτρέψτε μου από αυτό το βήμα να εκφράσω την αλληλεγγύη μου στους νέους της Ουκρανίας που βιώνουν ένα πόλεμο και τους νέους του Ναγκόρνο Καραμπάχ. Οι νέοι αυτοί βιώνουν κάτι το οποίο δεν το επέλεξαν και εμείς καλούμαστε εδώ να καλέσουμε τα κράτη-μέλη να αναπτύξουν δομές προσβάσιμες για την καταπολέμηση του στίγματος ψυχικής υγείας. Αλλά ταυτόχρονα να δούμε και πώς θα μπορούσαμε στο μέλλον να έχουμε υποστηρικτικές υπηρεσίες για τους νέους μας, οι οποίοι ως μέλη του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης είναι μέσα σε ένα πόλεμο που δεν έχουν επιλέξει και όλοι αυτοί ως αυριανοί πολίτες, οι οποίοι θα καλούνται να λάβουν τις τύχες των χωρών τους, θα πρέπει να είναι υγιεί πολίτες. Γιατί αυτό που μετράει, αγαπητοί κύριοι συνάδελφοι, είναι οι υγιεί πολίτες να είναι δημοκρατικοί πολίτες. Άρα πρέπει να δούμε πώς θα μπορέσουμε να καταπολεμήσουμε το στίγμα, να δώσουμε πρόσβαση σε υπηρεσίες οι οποίες θα είναι ανοιχτές μέσα στην κοινότητα, δεν θα είναι διχαστικές, θα έχουν μέσω τους την συμπερίληψη και ταυτόχρονα μέσα από αυτή τη διαδικασία, γιατί οι δύο εκθέσεις, επιτρέψτε μου να σας πω, συνδέονται τόσο το κομμάτι των εξαρτήσεων όσο και το κομμάτι της ψυχικής υγείας. Όσον αφορά την εκπαίδευση των γονέων, είναι πολύ σημαντικό ότι το θέτει αυτό η έκθεση και αυτές οι δύο εκθέσεις μας δείχνουν ότι η συνεργασία των πολιτικών ομάδων, μας δείχνει η συνεργασία όλων των εξειδικευμένων φορέων μπορεί να οδηγήσουν την επόμενη μέρα τα κράτη-μέλη να θεσπίσουν πολιτικές συμπεριληπτικές για την καταπολέμηση και του στίγματος αλλά και της εξάρτησης. Μιας εξάρτησης η οποία δεν συνάδει με τον ευρωπαϊκό τρόπο ζωής από τη στιγμή που ζούμε στο πιο καλό και δημοκρατικό μέρος του πλανήτη. Από εκεί και πέρα νομίζω ότι η νέα γενιά και οι αξίες του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης πρέπει να είναι αυτές οι οποίες θα μας οδηγήσουν στο να φτιάξουμε τέτοιου είδους συστήματα, να υποστηρίξουμε τους νέους και υποστηρίζοντάς τους, υποστηρίζουμε τις χώρες μας, υποστηρίζουμε τη δημοκρατία. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Merci, monsieur. La parole est à Madame Larissa Bilozir de l'Ukraine. N'est pas là? Donc, la parole est à Madame Sevini Fatalieva de l'Azerbaïdjan.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, let me start from congratulating the rapporteurs for the excellent report they were preparing and for raising such an important issue in the discussion in this Assembly. The modern world, which changes every day, offers young people various opportunities and confronts them with huge choice. How to take advantages of these opportunities, how to make the right choice depends on the environment the children find themselves. The tendency of teenagers to quickly absorb everything new and interesting plays a crucial role in their formation. And in all this variety of choices, children can simply get lost if there is a lack of communication with peers and significant people for teenagers, lack of attention from parents, lack of confidence in yourself and your strengths, shyness, the desire of a teenager to be like everyone else of his peers, to follow their hobbies and to keep up. In such situations, certain addiction may arise, and it's important to note that not all the children who engage in addictive behaviors will develop addiction. However, if left unaddressed or untreated, these behaviors may escalate and have a significant impact on child's well-being and functioning. With rapidly spreading digitalization worldwide, more and more people, and particularly increasingly young children, are spending an increasing number of hours per day online reading on screens of devices. And this growing habit is likely to engender multiple health risks such as blindness, obesity, sleep disorders, anxiety, and depression, leading to impaired performance at school and behavior problems. Also, inappropriate or misleading content can influence their beliefs and behaviors. The potential impact of this risk on children's future lives and well-being of future societies as a whole could be dramatic, and public awareness of this problem needs to be fostered in communities as well as on a worldwide scale. That's why it's necessary to present facts about the danger of interaction with objects or actions that cause addictive behavior, help children to develop skills in recognizing and expressing emotions, increasing self-esteem, identifying values that are significant for an individual, developing communication and decision-making skills, and also develop healthy habits which can become a barrier to the formation of addictive behavior. Legislation can play a crucial role in preventing addictive behaviors in children by creating a framework for regulation and restrictions. Laws can set age limits for the purchase and consumption of addictive substances, such as alcohol, tobacco, and certain drugs, restricting the marketing and advertising of addictive products, especially in ways that appeal to children. And it's essential that legislation keeps pace with the rapidly evolving digital landscape to effectively protect children. Collaboration between governments, tech companies, child advocacy organizations, and parents is vital in achieving this goal. While legislation is an important tool in addiction prevention, it should be part of a comprehensive strategy that includes education, parenting, and community involvement. And also, prevention of addiction is a rather difficult process in psychological, legal, and organizational terms. All preventive work with children must be carefully thought out and requires a responsible, thoughtful, and professional approach from adults, the presence of certain knowledge, and its constant expansion. Only through systematic work and maintaining the unity of all participants in this educational relations are sustainable results and which will be effective. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. La parole est à Madame Carmen Leite de l'Espagne.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Quiero felicitar a los autores de los dos reports. Yo me voy a referir sobre todo al de salud mental, pero los dos son excelentes informes. Los niños y jóvenes requieren un entorno que les proporcione seguridad, que les ayude a desarrollar su autoestima. Su salud mental se ve perjudicada por la adversidad social crónica en la que viven muchos de nuestros jóvenes, la violencia en sus hogares y en las escuelas y comunidades, la alta disponibilidad de sustancias ilícitas y el mal uso de Internet, también la explotación en todas sus formas y la falta de oportunidades de desarrollo. Eso no contribuye a su estabilidad ni a su salud mental. Me siento, por supuesto, orgullosa del Sistema Nacional Español, uno de los mejores valorados por ser un sistema público universal, equitativo y gratuito. Pero este es un tema que actualmente preocupa. Según datos de UNICEF, en España, 1 de cada 5 menores entre 10 y 19 años sufren algún tipo de problema de salud mental diagnosticado, con datos muy preocupantes del incremento del suicidio. Es terrible pensar que entre los 15 y 29 años el suicidio es la segunda causa de muerte, solo superada por los tumores malignos. La pandemia lo empeoró, pero ya pasó y seguimos en ratios malos, y las medidas están siendo insuficientes. Hay que hacer mucho más a escala europea y por eso este informe es tan bienvenido. Considero necesario un plan de salud mental que priorice las acciones entre los más jóvenes, con acciones concretas y transversales entre el sector sanitario, educativo, social y las familias. Las escuelas y la atención primaria son importantísimas para la prevención, detección y tratamiento oportuno. Tendrían que ser más transversales y colaborar también más con las familias, dando cursos de formación. También serían necesarios cursos de formación para los médicos y enfermería en atención primaria. Sobre este tema, creo que es importante ya en sí que lo estemos hablando en el Consejo de Europa, la casa en la que se defienden los derechos de los ciudadanos. Y, por supuesto, estoy a favor del informe del señor Mauquín y del otro informe. Muchas gracias y felicidades a ambos ponentes. Las merecen. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carmen. La parole est à Madame Berlin-Ilike de la Türkei.
Dankeschön, Frau Vorsitzende. Vielen Dank für diesen Bericht an Frau Stoica und Herr Motkin. Drogenabhängigkeit ist ein globales Problem der öffentlichen Gesundheit. Seine Folgen betreffen nicht nur Einzelnen, sondern auch Familie und sogar die Gesellschaft. Obwohl Sucht bei Menschen fast jeden Alters vorkommt, ist ist die Sucht bei Kindern hinsichtlich ihrer Folgen gefährlicher. Der Schutz von Kindern vor Drogenabhängigkeit ist durch die Bemühungen des Einzelnen, der Familie und der Gesellschaft möglich. Die sich verändernden technologischen Bedingungen wirken sich auf das Leben der Menschen aus. Als Folge der technologischen Entwicklungen sind Kinder von der Nutzung dieser Technologien anders und intensiver betroffen als Erwachsene. Dieser Effekt hat viele positive und negative Auswirkungen auf das Leben der Kinder. Durch die Ermittlung der Auswirkungen der digitalen Sucht auf Kinder kann eine Perspektive für einen bewussteren Umgang mit der Technologie aufgezeigt werden. Die negativen Auswirkungen der zunehmenden Bildschirmzeit werden durch zahlreiche Studien gestützt, die zeigen, dass Faktoren wie körperliche Inaktivität, psychosoziale Probleme, Schlafstörungen, Störungen der Ernährung, Exposition gegenüber Werbung und Zunahme des Verzehrs ungesunder Lebensmittel ein Risiko für Fettleibigkeit darstellen. Zur Bekämpfung der Fettleibigkeit wird außerdem empfohlen, der körperliche Aktivität zu fördern. Die Sucht nach digitalen Spielen, die Kinder bedroht. Die Sucht nach digitalen Spielen, die Kinder bedroht, kann auch ihre Entwicklungen beeinträchtigen. Digitale Spiele bergen biopsychosoziale Risiken für Kinder, wie zum Beispiel zu viel Zeit mit Spielen zu verbringen, den Unterricht zu stören, sich mit Spielfiguren zu assoziieren und übermäßig zu reagieren, wenn sie beim Spielen gestört werden. Andererseits können sich Computerspiele auch negativ auswirken, weil Kinder noch keine Verurteile wie die Unterscheidung zwischen gut und schlecht, richtig und falsch entwickelt werden. Ein Spiel mit gewaltigem Inhalt steht für ein Kind oder einen Jugendlichen, der nicht zwischen richtig und falsch unterscheiden kann, eine negative Störung dar. Wenn Kinder ihr ganzes Leben vor Bildschirmen verbringen, bedeutet dies auch, dass sie weniger Zeit für soziale Interaktionen und Beziehungen zu Gleichaltrigen haben, die für die soziale und psychologische Entwicklung von Kindern wichtig sind. Ich danke Ihnen.
Merci beaucoup. La parole est à Madame Naomi Katia de Malte. Elle n'est pas là. Donc, la parole est à Monsieur Yuri Kamelchuk de l'Ukraine. Je vous en prie, Monsieur.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, colleagues. Unfortunately, we remember or we negotiate our problems if they go into a big scale. But sometimes we need to focus on small problems when they only born. You know that now dependence or mental dependence is not only about some kind of drugs. It's also now based on social media and online games, and it is very deep inside, because now it hurts our children. Who is responsible for this? Of course, we are responsible for this. Why it happened? Maybe because we are working too much, or maybe we are focusing not on proper things. Maybe we are focusing on our own problems and forget about people who we get responsible for. But in this time, there is a people who are building business on those problems, and they are criminals. Why? Because sometimes it's classical scheme. They just organize some online games or just selling drugs, but sometimes it's hidden schemes. It's classical scheme of non-fair business is make a problem to solve a problem with the money. So if we will look on the other side of this problem, which sometimes helping to prevent mental problems, it's taking special drugs for mental health. So maybe we don't need to produce those drugs if we will focus on those problems in the beginning. Sometimes those problems will not happen if we will change our focus on those people who is close to us, and the closest is our children, and the children is our future. If we will change the focus for our future, for our children, we can change this problem, and we will not have the mental disabilities in the future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. La parole est à Monsieur Peter Frick de Liechtenstein.
Sehr geehrte Frau Vorsitzende, liebe Kolleginnen! Zu Beginn möchte ich mich bei den beiden Rapporteurinnen für ihre wichtige Arbeit bedanken. In meinem Statement möchte ich mich auf den Bericht Vorbeugung von Suchtverhalten bei Kindern konzentrieren. Ich glaube, wir sind uns alle einig, dass Kindern aufgrund ihrer besonderen Vulnerabilität und Bedürfnisse ein besonderer Status in unserer Gesellschaft zukommen muss. Die Pandemie und die aktuell schwierige geopolitische Lage haben diese Notwendigkeit erneut bestätigt. Das vermehrte Aufkommen von Suchtverhalten von Kindern als Bewältigungsstrategie in dieser unsicheren Lage ist daher alarmierend. Ich möchte das besondere Potenzial von Schulen und Sportvereinen in diesem Bereich hervorheben. Eine kindgerechte Aufklärung über Sucht und deren Gefahrenpotenziale spielen eine zentrale Rolle in der Vorbeugung von Suchtverhalten bei Kindern. Als Orte, an denen Kinder aller gesellschaftlichen Schichten zusammenkommen, können Schulen und Sportvereine als sicherer Raum dienen, in welchem auch gesunde Bewältigungsstrategien effektiv vermittelt werden können. Dennoch muss uns bewusst sein, dass das Internet ganz neue Gefahren im Hinblick auf Sucht bei Kindern mit sich bringt. Grenzübergreifende Regelungen zu diesem Bereich, die einen effektiven Schutz von Kindern ermöglichen, ohne gleichzeitig disproportional in ihre Privatsphäre einzugreifen, sind dringend notwendig. Eine führende Rolle des Europarats in diesem Bereich, allenfalls wie im Bericht vorgeschlagen der Pompidou-Gruppe, würde ich sehr begrüßen. Vielen herzlichen Dank.
Merci beaucoup. La parole est à Madame Olympia Girón Hernández du México.
Es un placer, Presidenta. Gracias. La prevención educativa de la drogadicción es una pregunta de seguridad nacional. La prevención de las adicciones es uno de los 3 pilares fundamentales del Acuerdo Nacional de Educación, consistente en la adopción de una cultura de paz, la lucha contra el consumo de drogas y el respeto al Estado de Derecho. Para el presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador, la recuperación de los valores humanistas requiere de la lucha del narcoestado que heredó para convertirlo en un Estado de Derecho. Y en este marco de transformación se decidió colocar la urgencia de garantizar de manera integral el desarrollo de una vida saludable para los niños, niñas y adolescentes. En este contexto, ha invertido en hacer de la lucha contra las adicciones un tema de seguridad nacional en México, enfocándose en la prevención como la política pública más efectiva para garantizar el derecho de las niñas, niños y adolescentes a un desarrollo psicosocial saludable. coordinado por un gabinete multisectorial, propuso como un tema interdisciplinario las acciones de prevención de drogas adoptadas en la nueva escuela mexicana, cuyo objetivo es provocar un conocimiento científico de los daños causados por las diferentes drogas, analizar y deconstruir racionalmente los mitos generados en torno al uso de estas drogas y así reducir el bajo rendimiento escolar, el desarrollo de la violencia como forma de interacción entre la comunidad escolar y, sobre todo, la deserción escolar. Como parte de esta política, el gobierno mexicano ha creado la Beca de Educación Básica Benito Juárez para asistencia social, con un presupuesto de 15,000 millones de euros, el 3.4% del presupuesto de la Federación para garantizar el derecho a la educación. El programa Si te drogas, te haces daño es una estrategia interinstitucional en la que participa la Secretaría de Educación Pública, cuyo objetivo es implementar acciones en las aulas y una potente campaña de difusión para que contribuya a la prevención del consumo de drogas entre los estudiantes de secundaria y bachillerato a través de los espacios de reflexión y mensajes de comunicación asertiva. El programa cuenta con una guía para docentes, otra para padres de familia, un espacio virtual para docentes, padres y alumnos y el apoyo de especialistas. En caso de detectarse adicciones, la comunidad escolar recibe apoyo de las autoridades sanitarias para atender el caso, bajo la coordinación del Consejo Nacional de Prestación de Servicios para la Atención, Cuidado y Desarrollo Integral de los Niños, COPSADI, conformado por 70 instituciones dedicadas a la atención de niñas, niños y adolescentes. El grupo multidisciplinario ha creado un subgrupo de seguimiento para fortalecer las escuelas con signos de alerta temprana a casos graves. Muchas gracias.
Merci beaucoup. Chers collègues, il nous faut maintenant interrompre l'audition des orateurs. Les orateurs inscrits qui, présents pendant le débat, n'ont pu s'exprimer, peuvent transmettre dans les 4 heures leur intervention dactylographie au service de la séance pour publication au compte-rendu. Ce texte ne doit pas dépasser 400 mots et doit être transmis par voie électronique. Et j'appelle la réplique de la Commission. Monsieur Moutkin, vous avez la parole pour 4 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Ça va être très compliqué de répondre à vos nombreuses interventions en 4 minutes, mais d'abord, chaleureusement, vous remercier pour le soutien à ce rapport, mais surtout le soutien à ces recommandations. Je vais commencer par commenter le rapport de ma collègue de la Commission, Madame Stoïka, en disant que c'est un avis personnel. Donc n'en prenez pas compte dans votre vote dans quelques minutes, puisque Madame Stoïka n'est pas là. Mais en tout cas, je lui transmettrai les différentes remarques. Peut-être 2 petites choses. Sur la question des drogues, en effet, le rapport de Mme Stoïka insiste la prévention, c'est vraiment l'outil principal. Et je vous rejoins tout à fait dans les mesures aussi sécuritaires qu'il faut pouvoir prendre sur une diffusion de drogue sur des publics jeunes. Ceci dit, je me permets d'ajouter à titre personnel que ça fait des décennies que l'Europe, l'Occident, lutte contre les drogues de manière uniquement sécuritaire, et je pense que si la question des drogues ne rentre pas dans le giron sanitaire, on n'y arrivera pas, que ce soit pour les jeunes ou les moins jeunes. Et je voudrais saluer à ce titre-là le travail du Portugal. Je sais que Madame la Présidente est élue du Portugal, qui a fait un travail gigantesque pour avoir une autre approche sur la lutte contre les drogues qui a fonctionné, qui fonctionne. 112 personnes décédées il y a quelques années par an des drogues dures au Portugal, 12 personnes uniquement l'année dernière. Donc c'est la preuve qu'il y a d'autres approches qui sont combinables avec l'approche sécuritaire qui doivent être traitées. Sur la question des jeux vidéo, je vous rejoins. Les jeux vidéo et l'Internet de manière générale, c'est en effet un vrai danger pour beaucoup de jeunes. Mais questionnons-nous quand même, il faut qu'on se questionne collectivement sur qu'est-ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, un jeune préfère rêver derrière un écran que rêver avec ses amis, rêver avec sa famille, rêver de sa vie plus tard. Et donc je crois que ça dit quand même quelque chose de notre société si aujourd'hui des jeunes, et pas que des jeunes d'ailleurs, des moins jeunes aussi, veulent passer du temps derrière un écran. Sur les considérations plutôt de mon rapport, je voudrais d'abord répondre à ma collègue grecque et vous remercier parce que vous avez abordé la question de la pauvreté. Et je pense en effet que j'ai oublié de dire que les premières victimes des troubles de santé mentale, c'est les personnes vulnérables, les personnes précarisées, les femmes monoparentales qui vivent seules, les personnes LGBT, QIA+, les personnes migrantes qui parfois n'ont pas accès à tout un service de santé mentale. À mes collègues ukrainiens, mais aussi M. Stamatis de Grèce, je voudrais d'abord vous redire tout mon soutien à la jeunesse, notamment ukrainienne. Vous savez qu'un événement va être organisé à Paris le 15 décembre, qui a été validé par le bureau ce matin, un événement qui traitera de la déportation des enfants en Russie, les enfants ukrainiens en Russie, mais aussi des enfants blessés à cause de l'agression russe. Et vous savez tout mon soutien. Notre collègue grec nous a parlé du Haut-Karabakh et je tiens aussi à présenter mon soutien aux jeunes qui vont subir des conséquences sur leur santé mentale qui sont déplacés aujourd'hui. Et d'ailleurs, ma collègue allemande a aussi évoqué la jeunesse israélienne. Je ne peux pas faire l'impasse sur, en effet, avoir une pensée pour eux qui subissent des actes terroristes. On a été en Norvège, je ne peux pas ne pas penser à tous ces jeunes d'un parti politique qui sont morts il y a quelques années à cause de l'extrême droite aussi, et des conséquences sur la santé mentale catastrophiques. Donc oui, la santé mentale, les conflits, la géopolitique impactent la santé mentale, et je pense qu'un rapport spécifique là-dessus. Et je suis désolé si certains d'entre vous ne seront pas d'accord avec moi, mais je ne veux pas me taire là-dessus. Ce matin, l'armée israélienne a ordonné l'évacuation de 1,1 million de personnes. 1,1 million de personnes. Antonio Guterres des Nations Unies nous dit bien que c'est impossible d'évacuer 1,1 million de personnes. Et je me souviens d'un chiffre qui a été donné par l'OMS il y a quelques années. À Gaza, 30% des jeunes enfants n'ont aucun désir de vivre. 30%. Et je pense que ça doit aussi nous questionner. Nous sommes la maison des droits humains, nous sommes la maison des droits de l'homme. Les droits de l'homme n'ont pas de frontières, les droits de l'homme n'ont pas de camp, nous sommes le camp des droits humains. Et aujourd'hui, on doit s'alerter et s'alarmer des conséquences, je pense, de ces futurs bombardements qui ont déjà eu lieu. Je terminerai par dire deux choses rapidement, excusez-moi de dépasser un peu le délai. La première chose, c'est que c'est important d'intégrer les jeunes dans tout le processus décisionnel, que nous, politiques, on met en place pour leur redonner confiance envers l'État. Et la dernière chose que j'aimerais dire à la jeunesse européenne, c'est n'ayez pas honte de traverser des moments de souffrance. Moi-même, qui ai mis du temps à accepter qui j'étais, à accepter ma sexualité, j'ai aussi traversé des moments de souffrance. N'ayez pas honte, il y a toujours une lumière au bout du tunnel. Les politiques, la société doivent être là pour vous aider, pour vous soutenir, c'est le plus important. On sort de ces moments de souffrance, ils sont passagers, il faut pouvoir en parler. Il faut que nous aussi, responsables politiques, on puisse parler parfois de nos émotions, c'est important. Et donc, je voudrais remercier chaleureusement tous les jeunes que j'ai rencontrés pour ce rapport, remercier Anita Golami du secrétariat et le secrétariat en général qui fait un excellent travail pour nos rapports, et vous remercier toutes et tous pour vos interventions. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur le rapporteur. Merci beaucoup, Simon. Est-ce que Madame la vice-présidente de la Commission, Madame Olga Komenko, désirez-vous répondre aussi? Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Ms. President, dear colleagues. On behalf of the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development, I would like to warmly congratulate the two rapporteurs, Mr. Simon Mutka and Ms. Diana Stoica, on their excellent reports. As Mr. Mutka very accurately points out in his report, young people's mental health and well-being are impacted by a world faced with multiple crises and much uncertainty. Pandemic, wars, and natural disasters, displacements, cost of living, and the triple planetary crisis, feelings of uncertainty about what is to come. The more risk factors young people are exposed to, the greater potential impact on their mental health. We know that mental health problems and addictive behaviors in children and young adults are closely linked. The prevention of addictive behaviors in children must be an urgent priority in our member states, as it can give disastrous effects on their mental and physical health and on their development. Unfortunately, we know that young people from disadvantaged socio-economic backgrounds with disabilities, LGBTQI+, minorities, refugees, and undocumented migrants undoubtedly suffer the most. And we should also put a specific focus on children abducted by Russian Federation and injured during aggressors' attacks. Both reports provide good policy recommendations and best practice examples to member states, which I hope they will take into account. Prevention of mental health problems and addictive behavior must come as early as possible, be holistic, non-stigmatizing, and treat the person as a whole. This includes both mental and physical symptoms, as well as addressing socio-economic and environmental factors that impact the mental health and well-being of children and young adults. Ms. President, lastly, I would like to highlight the recommendation to the Committee of Ministers. It is of utmost importance that we remind of the firm position of the Assembly, our Commissioner on Human Rights, relevant United Nations agencies and mechanisms, and of independent experts and persons with lived experience against the use of coercion in mental health. Mental health care must be provided on a voluntary basis and must always respect the autonomy of the person receiving care. Any decisions of the Committee of Ministers should reflect this human rights imperative and be taken in line with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as interpreted by the CRPD Committee. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. La discussion générale est close. Nous passons maintenant à l'examen des projets de résolution et de recommandations, en commençant par le premier rapport, prévenir les comportements addictifs chez les enfants, document 15830. Sur ce premier rapport, la Commission des questions sociales, de la santé et du développement durable a présenté un projet de résolution et un projet de recommandation sur lesquels aucun amendement n'a été déposé. En absence d'amendement, nous allons directement procéder au vote sur le projet de résolution, puis sur le projet de recommandation. Nous allons d'abord procéder au vote sur le projet de résolution. Une majorité simple est requise. Le scrutin est ouvert. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage du résultat. Le projet de résolution est adopté à l'unanimité. Félicitations. Nous allons maintenant procéder au vote sur le projet de recommandation contenu dans le document 15830. Je vous rappelle que la majorité requise est celle de 2/3 des suffrages exprimés. Le scrutin est ouvert. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage du résultat et c'est aussi le projet de recommandation est aussi adopté à l'unanimité. Félicitations. Merci. Nous passons au second rapport sur la santé mentale et le bien-être des enfants et des jeunes adultes. document 15829. Sur ce second rapport, la Commission des questions sociales, de la santé et du développement durable a présenté un projet de résolution et un projet de recommandation sur lesquels aucun amendement n'a été déposé. En absence d'amendement, nous allons directement procéder au vote sur le projet de résolution, puis sur le projet de recommandation. Donc, nous allons procéder au vote sur le projet de résolution. Une majorité simple est requise. Le scrutin est ouvert. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage du résultat. Le projet de résolution est adopté à l'unanimité. Nous allons procéder au vote sur le projet de recommandation. Je vous rappelle que la majorité requise est celle de 2/3 des suffrages exprimés. Le scrutin est ouvert. Le scrutin est clos. Et je demande l'affichage du résultat. Et le projet de recommandation est adopté à l'unanimité. Merci beaucoup et félicitations. L'ordre du jour appelle à la présentation et la discussion du rapport de Mme Birgit Thorariksson au nom de la Commission des migrations, des réfugiés et des personnes déplacées sur la crise humanitaire émergente pour l'Afghanistan et les réfugiés afghans, document 15831. Je vous rappelle que nous devrons en avoir terminé avec l'examen de ce texte, vote inclus vers 12h55. Nous devrons donc interrompre la liste des orateurs vers 12h45 afin de pouvoir entendre la réplique de la Commission et procéder au vote nécessaire. Monsieur le rapporteur, vous disposez de 7 minutes pour la présentation de votre rapport et de 3 minutes pour répondre aux orateurs à la fin de la discussion générale. Monsieur le rapporteur, vous avez la parole.
Madam President, in September 2021, the Parliamentary Assembly called on member states to help neighboring countries and support Afghans fleeing Afghanistan in a resolution adopted. 2 years later, we are seeing a human rights and humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. Severe drought, conflict, Taliban takeover, attacks on women and girls, and earthquakes. Despite all this, Afghanistan has turned into a forgotten crisis. European solidarity has clearly been poor, and the number of Afghans that were resettled in EU is very low. In March 2023, 6 million people were on the brink of famine in Afghanistan. The freezing of assets in the central bank and the political isolation of the country are making the situation worse. The 2004 constitution has been suspended, judges have been removed from office, and religious and ethnic minorities are facing persecution. The systematic banning of women and girls from public life is such that some experts consider this as a war on women. In the meantime, pushbacks keep being reported across Europe. This has happened despite this assembly denouncing pushbacks for many years. Last time, 1 year ago, and voting in favor of preventing and sanctioning such practices. This is happening even through UNHCR has advised against return to Afghanistan as well as Iran and Pakistan since August 2021. Deportation to Afghanistan are not acceptable, particularly when it comes to women and girls. I believe that forced removals should be stopped and that voluntary return should be monitored in coordination with UNHCR. I had the opportunity to visit Turkey when preparing this report, which I'm grateful for. I also expressed my concerns regarding returns conducted to Kabul, as well as lack of registration of Afghans in Turkey. Dear colleagues, the current humanitarian and human rights crisis in Afghanistan is affecting over 3 million Afghans internally displaced by conflict, 1 million IDPs who have returned to their place of origin, and almost 10 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Iran. The number of Afghans in Europe differs sharply, with the exception of Turkey, which is hosting around 600,000 Afghans. In 2022, the number of Afghans resettled in the EU decreased by 72%. This is a very uneven distribution between Asia and Europe and between European states. We must acknowledge that the protracted crisis of Afghan refugees will not stop overnight. Pakistan and Iran have sheltered more than 95% of Afghan refugees for over 3 generations and are reaching the limit of what they can provide. The tiredness of the reception is clear and has a negative impact on the refugees. A few days ago, Pakistan announced that they would return Afghan nationals. So what should we do, dear colleagues? We cannot expect frontline countries like Turkey to provide support and shelter to the vast majority of Afghan refugees present in Europe. This crisis is not going to stop tomorrow. Europe must do more. Refugees from Afghanistan have the second highest resettlement needs in the world. Failing on solidarity will result in restricted access to protection for those in need and increasing bitterness against the presence of refugees, which is at odds with the values and norms of the Council of Europe. The draft resolution provides concrete ways and recommendations to arise this solidarity, namely through increased resettlement, especially for women and girls. The draft resolution calls for increased resettlement quotas. Let us not forget that the vast number of people dying en route to Europe or stranded in hotspots are Afghans. The draft resolution makes some concrete suggestions to ease and fasten resettlement and visa processing. Dear colleagues, systematic persecution against Afghan women is a shame. We must do our utmost to protect women and girls away from what is a war on women. To support the commitment by the committee, I do support the commitment by the Committee of Ministers to fund specific assistance and humanitarian resettlement programs for women and girls who are victims of risk of violence against women or trafficking in human beings. Another important point of my report is the situation of Afghan children. Many unaccompanied children in Europe are Afghan. Registering Afghan unaccompanied children as international protection seekers is very important. The report aims to provide concrete recommendations in support to Afghans in need of protection in Afghanistan and in neighboring countries. Most of the Western embassies are closed in Kabul. Accessing protection for Afghans usually involves traveling to Pakistan and Iran. However, it is difficult to leave Afghanistan and the journey extremely dangerous for women and children. That's why I'm in favor of resuming member states' consular services in Kabul in coordination with the UNHCR and with the EU Asylum Agency. Procedures may explore across member states how to tackle this issue. This report argues in favor of engaging with all political stakeholders in Afghanistan, including the de facto authorities. I am strongly convinced that international isolation will only hurt the people of Afghanistan, and I am not the only one. 2 weeks ago, the UN stated that the international community must continue to engage with Taliban leaders despite deep disagreement with their approach to women's rights. Let's give diplomacy a chance. Engaging does not mean recognizing. The European Parliament adopted last week a resolution in this very room on the human rights situation in Afghanistan. It is highly symbolic that 2 weeks in a row in the same building, 2 parliamentary assemblies in Europe take the position on the issue. It demonstrates the importance of this issue. We must be serious on supporting the Afghan people. Coordination across member states is essential. I'm sorry to say that political leadership on Afghanistan is lacking. I very much hope that the Assembly will support this report and the draft resolution. I'm calling on you all today to communicate this message in your national parliaments and across parliaments. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Thornton, for this explanation. Now, in this debate, I call Mr. Mehmet Akalın for ALDE Group. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, I would first like to start by expressing ALDE Group's condolences for the victims of the earthquakes that hit Afghanistan this week. This disaster has created an even more urgent need for help and assistance. I would like to thank the rapporteur for the extensive work undertaken in the making of this report, which brings the tremendously concerning humanitarian situation in Afghanistan to our attention. It presents the challenges faced by the Afghan refugees who have been forced to flee their country and recommend solutions for the reception of these people across Europe. The rapporteur is right to underline the dire situation of women and girls whose rights have been drastically limited by the de facto authorities. They face forced marriages, segregation, physical and sexual violence. Since January 2021, more than 500,000 people have fled Afghanistan, with Iran and Pakistan hosting more than 95% of these refugees. The remaining fleeing to other parts of the globe, including Europe and all our member states. Turkey is hosting 600,000 Afghan refugees, which is 140,000 are registered, and nearly 4 million Syrians. There is clearly no doubt that the situation requires urgent international attention and that no country alone can meet the current flow of refugees from Afghanistan. The de facto authorities have had major impact on the suffering and oppression of the Afghan people. Ethnic and minority groups such as the Hazaras, Tajiks, Christians, and other underrepresented groups are being exposed to targeted violence and discrimination. We call for the reopening of an international support system for the victims and the removal of any restrictions and obstacles in the provision of humanitarian assistance. Emphasis needs to be placed on ensuring the allowance of proper access for the organizations providing this assistance. We urge member states to coordinate their humanitarian supports with UN agencies and NGOs. Engagement with the de facto authorities should be on condition that Afghanistan will not serve as a base for terrorism and respect human rights. Migration is a complex matter and most probably will intensify in the future. There are no simple solutions, but I hope that this discussion will contribute to the setting of clear, just, and human rights-oriented policies. By working together and concerted migration policy based on a fair shared responsibility of all member states can be developed. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call Ms. Nicole Hawks for European Conservative DA Group.
Der vorliegende Bericht ist ehrenwert und drückt unseren unbändigen Willen aus, uns als Menschenrechtsrat unermüdlich dafür einzusetzen, dass die Menschenrechte universell und überall auf der Erde Geltung erlangen. Leider gehen mehrere wichtige Aspekte verloren. Aus dem langwierigen Afghanistan-Einsatz der letzten Jahrzehnte müssen wir die schmerzliche Erkenntnis ziehen, dass es nicht möglich ist, Demokratie und Menschenrechte dort zu installieren, wo es absolut nicht gewünscht ist, wo die Bevölkerung mehrheitlich nichts damit anfangen kann und offen unsere Art zu leben und unsere Werte als Schwäche verachtet. Die aus unserer Sicht steinzeit-patriarchalische afghanische Gesellschaft selbst muss wollen, dass Männer und Frauen gleichberechtigt sind, muss verstehen, dass es notwendig ist, andere Religionen und Minderheiten zu schützen, dass Bildung das schärfste Schwert ist, um nur einige Punkte zu nennen. Sie müssen Rechtsstaatlichkeit verstehen und wollen. All das wollte der Westen bringen, mit Waffengewalt, mit NGOs, mit viel Geld. Dieses Unternehmen ist blutig gescheitert. Natürlich ist es unser Auftrag, Lösungen für die schwierige Herausforderung zu finden, vor die Afghanistan die Weltgemeinschaft stellt. Migration und Flüchtlinge sind davon nur ein kleiner Teil. Wir müssen verstehen, dass es keine Lösung ist, Millionen von jungen Männern aus Afghanistan in Europa aufzunehmen, die steinzeitpatriarchalisch sozialisiert sind und unsere Werte und unsere Art zu leben zutiefst verachten. Um es mit den Worten von Peter Schollatur zu sagen, wer halb Kalkutta aufnimmt, der rettet nicht Kalkutta, sondern wird selbst zu Kalkutta. Als Mutter von 4 Kindern, die kein Interesse daran hat, dass Europa zu Enklaven von Kalkutta, Palästina, Afghanistan und so weiter und den damit importierten Konflikten wird, sage ich, Stopp! Schluss mit der Hybris, dass wir in Europa diese Konflikte in unsere westlichen Gesellschaften einfach absorbieren können. Ganz im Gegenteil müssen wir alles dafür tun, dass wir Menschenrechte, Demokratie und Rechtsstaatlichkeit für unsere Nachfahren hier in Europa erhalten und sie erfolgreich gegen die Verachtung, Missachtung und Herabsetzung durch zuwandernde Kulturen verteidigen. Auch die Selbsterhaltung Europas ist unsere Pflicht, meine Damen und Herren. Wir helfen niemandem, wenn wir den Krieg gegen Frauen und unsere Gesellschaft und unsere Werte nach Europa verlagern. Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Now I call Ms. Natasha Sukic from United Left.
Thank you, Chair. There are now more than 4 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan. More than 600,000 Afghans have fled to Pakistan since the return of the Taliban to Kabul. Many rightly fear retaliation from the Taliban regime on their return home. What makes this week's news and new circumstances which deepen the Afghan refugee crisis all the more frightening is that on Tuesday, Pakistani's interim government decided to deport within 28 days 1.7 million Afghans who do not have regular documents. In a given situation, it is of course impossible for the refugees to obtain those documents in a home country. Pakistani interim authorities are building their extremely hostile election campaign with the support of the media. Official Islamabad labels Afghans as criminals, mafia, drug traffickers, terrorists, job stealers, murderers, and Islamic extremists. The situation in Afghanistan has led to one of the largest protracted refugee situations for decades. For the 3rd year in a row, Afghans constitute the 2nd largest displaced population in the world. We face an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. We are facing widespread human rights violations, the war on women, girls have been banned from attending universities, and serious restrictions have been imposed in secondary schools. And a massive persecution of free-thinking people continues. The consequences of the combination of incompetent Taliban rule and international sanctions are devastating. The consequences of climate change have added their own, first with floods, then with drought. The country is ranking 5th among the countries most at risk due to the climate change worldwide. In addition, Afghanistan has been recently hit by 2 devastating earthquakes. Afghanistan is experiencing the worst humanitarian disaster in the world. 18 million Afghans, almost half of the Afghan population, are currently facing acute famine, according to the UN. 30 million people depend on humanitarian aid. But the UN Relief Fund for Afghanistan is almost empty. Only $800 million has been raised, less than a quarter of the expected funding. Europe must take responsibility for Afghan refugees and must not turn into a fortress. All deportations of Afghan citizens have to be stopped. Procedures for granting international protection status to Afghan people must strictly take into account the fact that Afghanistan is not a safe country. In view of the alarming and catastrophic situation, the adoption of the resolution we are considering today is more than urgent. The proposed resolution offers many concrete responses to tackle the issue of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and it therefore should be given our full support. Though we must not forget, dear colleagues, that the only real and long-term solution to stop refugee flows is to tackle the crisis hotspots from which people are fleeing war and poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I call Ms. Derya Türk-Nachbaur for the Socialist Group.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Präsident, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen. Wie der vorliegende Bericht eindeutig herausstellt, hat sich seit der Machtübernahme der Taliban die humanitäre Situation in Afghanistan dramatisch verschlechtert, insbesondere für Frauen und Mädchen, die inzwischen weitgehend vom öffentlichen Leben ausgeschlossen sind. Vor 3 Tagen war Weltmädchentag. Während viele Gebäude auf der Welt an diesem Tag pink leuchteten, ist und bleibt die Welt für die Mädchen in Afghanistan tiefdunkel. Die Perspektivlosigkeit in diesem geschundenen Land hat unvorstellbare Ausmaße angenommen. Die Zahlen sprechen eine ziemlich deutliche Sprache. Rund 30 Millionen Menschen, das ist mehr als die Hälfte der Bevölkerung, der afghanischen Bevölkerung, sind auf humanitäre Hilfe angewiesen. Unter ihnen leiden 4,7 Millionen an Unterernährung, darunter knapp 4 Millionen Kinder. 130.000 von ihnen sind vom Hungertod bedroht. Das Welternährungsprogramm, wir haben es gehört, der Vereinten Nationen warnt vor einer Hungersnot in Afghanistan. Durch den nahenden strengen Winter in Afghanistan wird die Lage ganz besonders kritisch. Nachdem die Taliban die Macht wieder übernommen haben, sind die internationalen Hilfen für Afghanistan deutlich heruntergefahren worden. Für viele verzweifelte Familien liegt der Ausweg aus der Hungerspirale im Verkauf ihrer Kinder. Ja, Sie haben es richtig gehört, im Verkauf ihrer Töchter. Das Brautgeld, das sie für ihre 11-, 12-, 13-jährigen Töchter bekommen, ernährt die Familien für eine kleine Weile. Die Zahl der Kinderbräute und Zwangsehen, haben wir auch gehört, ist dramatisch gestiegen. Es ist alles einfach nur eine furchtbare Tragödie. Hinter diesen Zahlen stehen nicht nur numerische, abstrakte Größen, sondern das Schicksal von unschuldigen Menschen, von Kindern, die ihre Zukunft noch vor sich haben sollten, die sie aber nicht haben. Und als seien die katastrophalen Lebensbedingungen nicht schlimm genug, wurde der Nordwesten des Landes am Wochenende von mehreren Erdbeben heimgesucht. 2500 Menschen sind unter den Trümmern gestorben. Die Krankenhäuser vor Ort sind mit mehreren tausend Verletzten so stark ausgelastet, dass sie ihrer Hilfe nicht mehr nachkommen können. Es fehlt an Medikamenten, an Betten, an Gerätschaften. Kurzum, humanitäre Hilfe wird dringend benötigt. Aus der direkten Nachbarschaft hat Afghanistan keine Hilfe zu erwarten. Und in solch fragilen Kontexten haben es Extremisten leicht, sich auszubreiten. Der IS nutzt die Abwesenheit der internationalen Kräfte und ist gerade dabei, sich in einigen Provinzen breit zu machen. Die Stabilisierung der Region sollte uns allen ein wichtiges Anliegen sein, weil wir auch Fluchtursachen bekämpfen müssen. Und dafür bedarf es einer gewissen Präsenz in Afghanistan, von substanziellem Engagement im Rahmen regierungsferner Grunddienstleistungen bis hin zu konsularischen Dienstleistungen vor Ort, gerade um die effektive Unterstützung von Hilfsorganisationen bei ihrer Arbeit vor Ort zu gewährleisten. Auch wenn die gegenwärtige Lage uns vor große Herausforderungen stellt, den größten Beitrag zum Schutz der Menschen und vor allem der Frauen- und Mädchenrechte können wir eben nur vor Ort leisten. Vielen Dank für diesen sehr guten Beitrag und vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
Thank you. Now the last speaker for the political groups is Ms. Maria Siringela from EPP CD Group.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Of course, I would like to say thanks to Mr. Thodarisson for this excellent report. It is for sure that the 2021 events in Afghanistan have been seared into our collective consciousness. Families leaving their home, numerous refugees seeking for a safe land, women and girls losing some of their fundamental human rights. For sure, it is, like the rapporteur said, a war against women and girls in this country. The Council of Europe has a long-lasting commitment to safeguard human rights, democracy and the rule of law. In this moment, our duty is clear. We cannot turn a blind eye to what is happening in Afghanistan. In 2021, the crisis began. Our reaction in my country was immediate. Many ministries, along with civil society organizations and the US authorities, managed to bring safely to Greece more than 150 women, all in high-level positions with their families, such as members of the parliaments of Afghanistan, judges, activists. All of them were in death lists from the Taliban regime. We managed to orchestrate a silent, complex and risky mission to bring these women as refugees to Greece. We also secured for them shelter, medical care and the ability to move to other countries. And some of them did it, of course, following all of the legitimate procedures. Unfortunately, 2 years later, the situation keeps worsening. It proves that we need is coordinated efforts with international partners, with neighboring countries and humanitarian organizations. Only this way we can truly help those in need. Moreover, we must also promote stability and security in Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan have dreams, talents, a great potential to make their country as it was in the past, and especially, as we have already said, women and girls in Afghanistan. We need to provide them with the opportunity to rebuild their country, rebuild their lives, and contribute to the global community as well. Dear colleagues, the Council of Europe is guided by the principles of justice, human rights, and solidarity. The Afghan crisis, along with Ukraine and Nagorno-Karabakh crisis, are a test of our humanity. We cannot fail on it. Let us act bravely to help those suffering. Together we have the capacity to restore hope, to build a better world, leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final speaker is Ms. Petra Bayer.
Vielen lieben Dank, Herr Präsident. Seit mehr als 2 Jahren, als die Taliban die Macht übernommen haben in Afghanistan, sind Frauen fast vollkommen aus der Öffentlichkeit verbannt und verschwunden. Sie sind vom Arbeitsmarkt ausgeschlossen, sie haben kein Recht auf Bildung. In manchen Gegenden Afghanistan ist die Bildung von Mädchen über 10 Jahren komplett verboten. Das führt auch dazu, dass Mädchen kaum noch irgendwelche Perspektiven haben, dass das Dasein von Mädchen und Frauen ausgesprochen schwierig geworden ist, dass die Zweifel an der Sinnhaftigkeit ihrer Existenz bei ihnen selber sehr groß sind. Und wir sehen das auch, dass es zu mehr und mehr Selbstmorden unter Frauen und jungen Mädchen kommt, weil sie nicht mehr wissen, wie sie ihr Leben leben sollen. Die Taliban verfolgen Frauen und Mädchen nicht nur schwerwiegend, sondern auch wirklich systematisch, einfach aufgrund ihrer Zugehörigkeit, zu ihrer Geschlechterzugehörigkeit, einfach deswegen, weil sie Frauen und Mädchen sind und aus keinem anderen Grund. Und diese geschlechtsspezifische Verfolgung hat mittlerweile ein Ausmaß angenommen, das von der Internationalen Juristinneninstitution oder Vereinigung und Amnesty International als Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit eingestuft wird. Aus dieser Einstufung, aus dieser politischen Kategorisierung sollten wir auch unsere politischen Konsequenzen ziehen. Und einige Länder haben das auch schon getan, es ist zum Beispiel Finnland, Schweden und Dänemark, die Frauen aus Afghanistan mittlerweile prinzipiell als Flüchtlinge ansehen, weil sie als soziale Gruppe als solche verfolgt sind und ihnen deswegen einen leichteren Zugang zu Asylverfahren gewähren, zu humanitären Schutz gewähren als Prima Facie-Flüchtlinge. Und ich denke, das sollte etwas sein, was wir auch überlegen sollten, wie wir einfach auch mit der Frage, wie wir Frauen und Mädchen, die aus Afghanistan flüchten, Schutz gewähren, damit Leben retten können. Ich bin gerade dabei, einen Bericht zu erarbeiten für die Parlamentarische Versammlung zur Frage von der Situation von Frauenrechtsverteidigerinnen. Und abgesehen davon, dass ich mir die Situation von Frauenrechtlerinnen in Europa anschauen werde, möchte ich auch einen speziellen Fokus darauf legen, wie es den Frauen geht, Frauenrechtsaktivistinnen geht, die aus Afghanistan fliehen mussten in eines der Länder, der Mitgliedsländer des Council of Europes und wie denn hier mit ihnen umgegangen wird, wie sie hier dabei unterstützt werden, auch die Situation für die Frauen und Mädchen, die zurückbleiben mussten, die ein wirklich schlimmes Leben haben, wie sie unterstützt werden, da diesen Kampf auch hier in Europa weiterzuführen. Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you. I must now interrupt the list of speakers. The speech of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that typewritten text can be submitted electronically if possible, no later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. Now I call Mr. Thorarensen, rapporteur, to reply. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Afghans have suffered more than 40 years of conflict, natural disasters, chronic poverty, food insecurity, and most recently, the Taliban takeover, which has caused even more human suffering, displacement, and human rights violation against women and girls. I call on the Assembly, I call on all member states not to forget about the Afghan refugees. I hope that the recommendation demonstrated in this report will help member states help Afghans in need. I strongly believe that the recommendation will help Afghan refugees and help Afghan women and children in Afghanistan. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan should be of concern to all Council of Europe member states. Solidarity is needed in responding to the Afghan crisis. In a new era of conflict and violence in the world, we must not forget the people of Afghanistan, and we must speak up for them. We must use the tools of the Council of Europe, the European Development Bank, and the European Qualification Passport for Refugees programs. In this report, you will find the recommendation on how member states should protect Afghans in Europe. We need to increase resettlement quotas, stop forced removals, monitor voluntary return, establish a pan-European response, ease visa processing. The report also has a roadmap on Afghanistan outside of Europe for member states. The roadmap includes resuming consular services in Kabul, support local civil society and monitor human rights, stop international isolation of Afghanistan, give diplomacy a chance, engage with the de facto authorities in Afghanistan bring pressure to influence policy change, especially towards the full respect of the rights of women and girls, increase funding and resume development assistance. Mr. President, I want to thank the Secretariat for excellent work on this important issue and their openness to work on my ideas. Thank you all for expressing your views here today. Thank you for being concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and thank you all for being concerned about Afghan refugees. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the chairperson of the committee, Mr. Theodoros Rossopoulos, wish to speak?
Yes, Mr. President, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank my esteemed colleague Birgir Thorarinsson and my good friend Birgir, and of course the Secretariat for an excellent job, as always. This Honourable Assembly adopted a resolution on Afghanistan in the wake of the Taliban taking power by force in August 2021. Since then, the human rights situation has gone, as expected, from bad to worse, not least for women and girls, and so has a humanitarian situation. The situation in Afghanistan should, of course, be of gravest concern to all of us as members of the international community and as Europeans, which have seen Afghan refugees forced to exile for more than 40 years, including in our respective countries. No later than last week, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations adopted yet another resolution on the human rights situation in Afghanistan. That was a few days before, it was already mentioned, 2 major earthquakes hit the country, adding to an already desperate humanitarian crisis. Dear colleagues, speaking of a bleak picture is an understatement here. We may wonder, dear colleagues, what our Assembly may do beyond acknowledging such tragic situation and expressing our solidarity with the people of Afghanistan. That's exactly what this committee, the Committee of Migration, has been working on, and I commend Mr. Thorarisson's work to explore concrete avenues for the Council of Europe and for its member states in and outside of Europe, not only to address the protection needs of Afghan refugees, but also to envisage ways to engage beyond humanitarian action to the extent that is possible. Dear colleagues, Afghan refugees are the second refugee population in need of resettlement in the world. This has been the 3rd largest refugee population for years. We all in Europe know that the situation of Afghan refugees is not new, including in Europe. The situation in Afghanistan has worsened to an extent which sadly means that the grounds for forced displacement will certainly not cease overnight, nor will the responsibility for host countries on the road to exile to provide adequate and dignified reception and protection for this population, including in Europe. This may be considered as pious vows, and we have discussed at length in committee to hear from the concrete experience of Afghans in exile, as well as from those among civil society, refugee rights, defense, UN agencies and national authorities who know the situation and the needs. We have asked ourselves how members of PACE may contribute a useful input to this immensely complex and long-lasting situation in exile. Dear colleagues, refugees from Afghanistan are not of less importance than refugees of Ukraine or Nagorno-Karabakh. They all deserve equal attention and help from this Assembly. We cannot but congratulate Mr. Thorarinsson for his effort to bring as concrete elements as possible for a form of European engagement inside and outside Europe, and I call all you, dear colleagues, to support the resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Rossopoulos. Now the debate is closed. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15831. A simple majority is required. The vote is now open. Yes, the vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The draft resolution on document 15831 is adopted.
Thank you very much, dear Vice President Yildirim Turkish, for presiding. Our next business is to consider the changes proposed in the membership of committees. These are set out in document commissions 2023-07 and addendum 3. Are the proposed changes in the memberships of the Assembly's committee agreed to? I do not see any objection. The next item on today's agenda is the continuation of the debate on the progress report of the Bureau and the Standing Committee, which you'll find in document 15834, addendum number 3. At its meeting this morning, the Bureau has proposed several references to committees. They are set out in document 15834, addendum 3. These references must be submitted for ratification by the Assembly in accordance with Rule 26(3). Are there any objections to these references? I do not see any. So they are approved. I now propose that the other decisions in the progress report, which you find in document 15834, addendum 3, be ratified. Are there any objections? Do not see any. The progress report is approved. We now, dear colleagues, have come to the end of our business. And our business was a long, hectic, and challenging week, both in the hemicycle and in our commissions. I would like to sincerely thank all the members of the Assembly, particularly the rapporteurs, for their hard work during this past session. I refer to Madam Sybil Arslan, Madam Edith Estrella, Mr. John Howell, Mr. Darko Kevsky, Madam Elvira Kovic, Madam Olena Komenko, Madam Ingrid Skau, and Mr. Yildirim Turkish. I would also like to thank the staff and the interpreters, both permanent and temporary, who have worked so hard to make this part session a success. The first part session of the 2024 session will be held from 22 to 26 January of 2024. Allow me to make one last remark. This morning, the Bureau decided that the next progress report of the Assembly and the Standing Committee will be delivered by the outgoing President. I was nominated for that job because it's an honorable job. It also means that it's now official that I will be the outgoing President from January. But still, I tell you, I warn you, colleagues, there are still 4 months to go under my presidency. And again, there will never be a dull moment. I warn you and I warn the staff that in 4 months, we still will have a full-fledged, full agenda to deal with all the issues that are still before us. We will have the Standing Committee, we will have the meeting of the Bureau, we will have a lot of other visits on behalf of the presidency. But nevertheless, under normal circumstances, and you never know in these challenging and adventurous and difficult and dangerous times, but under normal circumstances, this will be the last time that I have the immense honor to sit on this chair to chair your assembly. And I would like to thank you for giving me the honor to do that from this place. I think in the overall we were successful. I declare the fourth-part session of the 2023 session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe closed. I would like to remind members to return their voting cards to the dedicated box at the entrance to the chamber before leaving the palace. The sitting is closed.